Section 1. The Boy from Kent. There is a small town in the northwestern corner of Connecticut called Kent. It sits in Litchfield County, tucked into a fold of forested hills where the Housatonic River bends quietly southward and the roads narrow into lanes that look almost unchanged from 50 years ago. The kind of town where the school secretary knows everyone's grandmother, where the church steeple is still the tallest thing for miles, where autumn comes like a slow fire moving through the canopy, gold and copper and deep red, before settling into the long gray quiet of a New England winter. This is where Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973. His parents had met in Boston in 1970, fallen in love the way young people do in cities they've just arrived in, and married that same year. They moved to Kent in 1972, 2 years before Seth came into the world. His father, Ronald, was a teacher at the Kent School, one of those old prep schools that New England seems to produce with quiet regularity, red brick buildings, Latin mottos carved above doorways, the smell of old wood and floor polish. His mother, Anne, worked in the admissions office there. They were not wealthy. They were comfortable, educated, community-minded people. Seth would grow up knowing the value of books and the geography of a small town in the way that becomes permanent, the kind of knowing that never fully leaves you even after you've moved to a bigger world. He had a younger sister named Rachel, who would eventually become a voice actress herself. Years later, she would lend her voice to characters on the very show her brother created, which says something quiet and beautiful about the MacFarlane family, that the creative impulse did not belong to just one of them. Seth started drawing at 2 years old, not scribbling the way most toddlers do, not the wobbly circle and stick figures that end up on refrigerators and get gently praised. He was drawing Fred Flintstone and Woody Woodpecker, recognizable characters he had seen on television, and reproducing them with the kind of focused deliberateness that adults don't usually associate with 2-year-olds. His parents noticed. They found a book about how flipbooks were made, the little stacked drawings you animate by flicking the pages with your thumb, and they gave it to him when he was 5. He studied it with the seriousness of someone who has just received instructions for something they have been preparing their whole life to do. By 5 years old, Seth MacFarlane knew he wanted to make cartoons. He has said this himself in interviews going back decades. Not that he thought it might be fun, not that it was one option among several. He knew that particular certainty is unusual in children, and it is usually the product of something precise happening in the nervous system when it encounters the thing it was built for. He saw animation on the family television, the Looney Tunes, and Hanna-Barbera productions that filled Saturday mornings in the 1970s and early 1980s, and something in him recognized it. Not as entertainment, as a language. He began carrying that language with him everywhere he went. By 9 years old, he had a paying job. He published a weekly comic strip called Walter Crouton in the local paper, the Kent Good Times Dispatch, for $5 a week. $5 was not nothing to a 9-year-old in 1982. And the strip was not nothing either. It had jokes. Real jokes. Satirical ones. One of the strips featured a character kneeling at the altar during communion, looking up and asking with complete seriousness, "Can I have fries with that?" The local priest wrote an angry letter. There was what MacFarlane would later describe as a little mini controversy. The paper printed the strip anyway. That moment, the priest's letter, the paper's decision to run the joke, regardless, tells you something about where Seth MacFarlane was going. He was 9 years old, already making jokes about sacred things, already probing for the soft edges where laughter lives beside discomfort, and the people around him were not discouraging this. They were printing it. He has a bloodline that goes deep into New England. His family's roots in the region stretch back to the 1600s. He is a descendant of William Brewster, a passenger on the Mayflower, one of the original 100 or so people who crossed the Atlantic in 1620 to build something new in a place that was completely foreign to them. That is the kind of ancestry that gets mentioned in family histories and occasionally in obituaries, but it also suggests something about the disposition of the people who carry it, a willingness to build from scratch, a tolerance for uncertainty, a belief that you can arrive somewhere entirely new and make it your home. Seth attended the Kent School for high school, the same institution where his father taught. He graduated in 1991. During his 4 years there, he continued drawing and animating. His parents gave him an 8mm film camera, and he used it. He made small films. He experimented with what a camera could do and what a drawn image could do when you set it in motion. He was not waiting for permission or instruction. He was practicing. His graphic influences in those years were Gary Larson of The Far Side, Matt Groening, whose Simpsons had just changed what animated television could be, and the deep catalog of Looney Tunes. His comedy influences ranged widely: Woody Allen, Mel Brooks, the anarchic English ensemble of Monty Python, the deadpan absurdism of Zucker Abraham Zucker, the working-class family dynamics of All in the Family. His music taste ran older still, all the way back to Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Bing Crosby, the orchestrated grandeur of the big band era, the sense that a single, well-placed note from a full arrangement could do something to a person's chest that no other instrument combination could replicate. All of this went in. The satire, the slapstick, the orchestration, the family comedy, the surreal non sequitur, the sacred thing made suddenly ridiculous. Every influence Seth MacFarlane absorbed in that small Connecticut town became ingredient. He went to college in 1991 at the Rhode Island School of Design, known to most people by its initials RISD, pronounced RISD. Located in Providence, Rhode Island, it is one of the most respected art and design schools in the United States, the kind of institution where Gus Van Sant and Robert Richardson also studied the sort of alumni list that tells you the place takes making things seriously. Seth enrolled in the film, video, and animation program, majoring in animation specifically. It was the right place. The faculty had worked in the industry. The equipment was professional grade. Students made field trips to film festivals. The approach was hands-on in the way that the best art education tends to be: throw you into the work and see what happens. He had intended originally to go work for Disney. That was the dream from the outside. Disney was the cathedral of American animation, the place that had produced Snow White and Bambi and Fantasia, the institution that had defined what animated storytelling meant for generations of people. To work there felt like arriving at the source. But something changed his mind during his years at RISD. He watched The Simpsons. The Simpsons premiered in December 1989, when Seth was 16. By the time he arrived at college in 1991, the show was already 2 seasons deep and doing something that had not been done before on American television in primetime animation. It was using the medium of cartoons to tell adult stories. It was letting the drawings be funny in the way drawings can be: funny, loose, and exaggerated and consequence-free, while simultaneously telling stories about real human things: disappointment, aspiration, the love between parents and children that exists even when everyone involved is behaving terribly. Matt Groening had cracked something open. Seth watched, and instead of thinking he needed to work for Disney, he started thinking he needed to make something like what Groening had made, but his own version, his own voice. Something that came from the security guard he overheard on the RISD campus one afternoon, a stocky Rhode Island man with a particular cadence to his speech, loud and self-assured and slightly absurd, who Seth filed away in the back of his mind. Something that came from a pet named Steve he had known, or a dog he had imagined, a dog who could talk and drink and carry the weight of everything a person wanted to say but found no polite occasion for. Something that came from Kent and the Housatonic and the priest's angry letter about the communion joke. He performed stand-up comedy during his time at RISD, working through jokes in front of audiences at the school. He met a fellow student named Patrick Henry, whose brother Mike would later become a voice actor on Family Guy, voicing Cleveland Brown and other characters across the show's run. The connections that would matter in Seth's professional life were already beginning to form in dormitory hallways and campus screenings. And in his senior year, he made his thesis film. He called it The Life of Larry. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're new here, the subscribe button is right there. It genuinely helps, and it's completely free. Section 2. The thesis film that started everything. When Seth MacFarlane sat down to make his senior thesis film at RISD in 1994, he was 20 years old and working almost entirely alone. The Life of Larry was animated, written, and produced by him. The only exception was a brief live-action segment, which some of his classmates helped him shoot in his home back in Kent, Connecticut. In the segment, a young MacFarlane himself appears, sitting at a table being served cheesecake, explaining his film and its characters as though pitching it to a television network. He had already decided, even before he finished making it, that what he was building was something more than a class project. The film ran for a few minutes, hand-drawn in a style that was deliberately rough around the edges, not polished like Disney, not as stylized as Hanna-Barbera's more iconic work, but immediate. Direct. The line quality was confident without being clean, which gave the images a kind of energy. You could feel the hand in them. The story followed a middle-aged everyman named Larry Cummings, a bumbling, somewhat dim-witted man living an unremarkable suburban life. Larry had a wife named Lois, he had an overweight teenage son named Milt, and most importantly, Larry had a dog. The dog's name was Steve. Steve was not a normal dog. Steve was intelligent, sardonic, and deeply exasperated by his owner's stupidity. He talked. The joke was that nobody seemed particularly surprised by this. He offered dry observations on Larry's behavior, delivered in the kind of wearied, slightly superior tone that a very smart creature develops after spending too long in the company of a very unaware one. If you watch The Life of Larry now, and you can find it online, having circulated on the internet for years before the full 15-minute pitch pilot McFarlane made for Fox was finally surfaced in 2022 and viewed publicly in early 2025, you immediately recognize the genetic code of what would become Family Guy. Larry's voice is rougher, less refined than what Peter Griffin would eventually sound like, but the character is the same creature, a man who means well and causes disasters, a man whose confidence is inversely proportional to his awareness, a man who loves his family in the distracted, bumbling way of someone who doesn't quite know how to express it but would never choose anyone else. Steve the dog would become Brian Griffin, and Lois would stay Lois. What is remarkable about The Life of Larry is not just its conceptual similarity to the show it would eventually become. It is the structural sophistication of the jokes. McFarlane had already figured out the cutaway. A character says something that triggers a reference, the film cuts briefly to an absurd illustration of that reference, then cuts back. The visual rhythm of it was already there, already working. At 20 years old, in a thesis film made with limited equipment in a college dorm, he also already had the political edge. One of the cutaway gags in The Life of Larry used actual audio of Newt Gingrich, the Republican House Speaker, presented in a context designed to make a pointed observation about political absurdity. McFarlane was already using animation as a vehicle for cultural satire, already comfortable embedding a real political figure into a cartoon as a punchline at 20 years old. The film was screened at the RISD Senior Film Festival in 1995. And at that screening, two people from Hanna-Barbera were in the audience. Ellen Cockrell, the studio's head of development, and Fred Seibert, the studio's president, both saw The Life of Larry that day. Cockrell, according to accounts of what happened, saw something specific in the film. She approached McFarlane. He was hired not based on his drawing ability, which was competent but not exceptional, but based on the writing. He was one of only a small number of people Hanna-Barbera had ever hired purely on the strength of what the scripts demonstrated. He graduated in 1995 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and moved west to Los Angeles. The world McFarlane entered at Hanna-Barbera in 1995 was one in transition. The studio had been an institution since William Hanna and Joseph Barbera had created it in 1957 and built Yogi Bear and the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo, programming that had defined what American animated television looked like for generations. By the mid-1990s, Hanna-Barbera was becoming Cartoon Network Studios, shifting its identity and its audience toward the cable animation renaissance that was beginning to reshape the medium. Shows like Dexter's Laboratory and Cow and Chicken were part of this new energy stranger, more idiosyncratic, less concerned with the clean moral lessons of older cartoon traditions. McFarlane described the atmosphere at Hanna-Barbera as resembling what he called an old-fashioned Hollywood structure. You moved between shows. One week you were a storyboard artist. The next you were a staff writer. You pitched in wherever the production needed you, and you absorbed the rhythms of professional animation by being inside them rather than studying them from outside. He worked on Dexter's Laboratory, which was already popular enough to be a cultural reference point among animation fans. He worked on Cow and Chicken. He spent the most time of all on Johnny Bravo, the show about a muscular, self-obsessed man-child who existed primarily to have his arrogance punctured repeatedly. Johnny Bravo ran on script writing in a way the other shows didn't. The humor was more verbal, more dependent on timing and dialogue, and McFarlane found he could develop his own voice more freely in that environment. On the Johnny Bravo crew, he met Adam West, the actor who had played Batman in the 1960s television series. West had a particular quality, a knowing self-awareness paired with absolute commitment to whatever absurdity he was asked to perform. MacFarlane filed that away too. Years later, when he needed someone to play the deeply eccentric mayor of a fictional Rhode Island city, he would remember exactly what Adam West could do and give him the role of Mayor Adam West, a character who shared the actor's name, which somehow made everything funnier. He did freelance work for Walt Disney Television Animation, writing for Jungle Cubs, a show about young versions of the Jungle Book's characters. He wrote for Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, the animated adaptation of Jim Carrey's film, produced by a Canadian company called Nelvana. Through Ace Ventura specifically, MacFarlane absorbed something valuable about writing elements he described as story progression and character stakes, the formal architecture of what makes a plot move. Even in a cartoon about a man who talked to his rear end, there were principles at work. He was studying them. Meanwhile, in 1996, he made a follow-up to The Life of Larry. He called it Larry and Steve, and it aired in 1997 as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons showcase, a programming block designed to give animators a platform to test new ideas. The short was slightly more polished than its predecessor and had been adjusted for a broader audience. The jokes were somewhat gentler, the edges were softer, but the characters were still there. Larry, the hapless middle-aged man, Steve, the talking dog, intellectual and dry. And for anyone watching carefully, there were seeds of the supporting cast that would eventually populate Quahog, Rhode Island. An airline pilot character appeared in Larry and Steve with a recognizable chin and a recognizable delivery. He would become Glenn Quagmire. A furniture store in the short was called Stewie's, the name that would belong to Peter Griffin's infant son. A character resembling Peter's father, Francis, passed through the background. It was as though the whole world of Family Guy was already waiting inside these short films, not yet fully formed, but present the way a photograph exists in the chemical on the surface of photographic paper before the developer brings it out. Fox broadcasting executives saw the Larry shorts. They had been watching animation carefully since The Simpsons had proven the form could deliver adult audiences to network television. A development executive at Hanna-Barbera introduced MacFarlane to Leslie Collins and Mike Darnell, who ran the alternative comedy department at Fox. There were conversations. Then King of the Hill premiered in 1997 and became a success, which told Fox that adult animation was not a single show phenomenon. The timing shifted. MacFarlane called Collins again. Fox made him an unusual offer. They gave him $50,000, roughly a 20th of what a standard pilot episode of animation cost to produce at the time, and asked him to make a 15-minute demo that could serve as a pitch for a full series. The creative control was entirely his. The budget was almost insultingly small. The timeline was aggressive. He went home to his apartment. He drew like he had not slept in months, which is the sort of thing that sounds like a figure of speech, but in this case was apparently literal. He described it later in an interview with the New York Times in terms that leave little room for romantic interpretation. I spent about 6 months with no sleep and no life, just drawing like crazy in my kitchen and doing this pilot. 6 months, in his kitchen, by himself. What he produced at the end of those 6 months would air, after some further development, on the 31st of January 1999, directly following Super Bowl 33, before an audience of 22 million people. But the origin of all of it was a 22-year-old animating alone in his kitchen in Los Angeles, by himself, working from a thesis film he had made in college, developing characters that had first appeared in his imagination when he was drawing Fred Flintstone at the age of 2 in a small Connecticut town by the Housatonic River. Section 3, Rhode Island School of Design and the Education of an Animator. The Rhode Island School of Design is not a comfortable institution. It was not designed to be. It was founded in 1877 in Providence, Rhode Island, with the explicit mission of connecting art and industry, of taking the making of things seriously as both aesthetic and commercial practice. The campus sits in the older part of Providence, a city that has always had a slightly haunted quality old buildings pressed together at odd angles, hills that run down unexpectedly to water, a sense that the past is not quite finished with you. RISD's film, video, and animation department was and remains one of the most rigorous training programs for animators in the country. The program did not coddle students. It pushed them toward technical proficiency while simultaneously refusing to let technical proficiency substitute for point of view. The faculty had professional experience. They knew what working in the industry actually required, and they were willing to teach it to students who were willing to do the work. Seth MacFarlane arrived in 1991 with a precise ambition and a clear aesthetic vocabulary that was already forming. He intended to work for Disney. That intention lasted roughly until he sat down and watched The Simpsons with the kind of sustained attention that changes your understanding of what a thing can be. It is worth pausing on what The Simpsons meant in 1991, because we are far enough from that moment now that it is possible to underestimate the shock of it. The show had premiered in 1989. By 1991, it was the most talked about show on television. Bart Simpson was on every piece of merchandise imaginable. The show had been on the cover of Time magazine, and what it was doing using the freedom of animation to say things about American family life, American culture, American self-deception that a live-action sitcom could not have said with the same force had simply not been done before in prime time. When Seth watched it at RISD, something recalibrated. Disney made movies. Disney made very good movies, and there was honor in the craft that went into them. But Disney movies were not saying anything particular about the way people actually lived in America in 1991. They were doing something older and more mythological. The Simpsons was doing something immediate. It was putting working-class frustration and suburban absurdity and the strange mixture of love and resentment that characterizes so many actual American families into a cartoon format, and making it funny and recognizable and occasionally devastating, all at the same time. MacFarlane wanted to do that. Not exactly what Groening was doing, but something in that vein. Something that had a point of view. He made films at RISD, several of them, short experimental works that tested what drawn images could do. He performed stand-up comedy on campus, developing timing that would eventually be the invisible architecture, holding up the joke delivery of 4 separate characters he would voice simultaneously on a television show. He met people who would matter. Mike Henry's brother Patrick was in his class, and through Patrick he would eventually connect with Mike, who would become Cleveland Brown and several other voices in the Family Guy world. The RISD program was also significant for what it taught him about working conditions. The department was small. Roughly 20 students per class chose animation, 17 or 18 chose live action, 5 full-time professors, and between 12 and 15 adjunct instructors. The environment was intimate in the way that the best educational environments tend to be, where the student-to-teacher ratio is low enough that the relationship becomes genuinely formative rather than merely transactional. It was in this environment that he made The Life of Larry in his senior year. What is interesting about the choice MacFarlane made for his thesis film is how autobiographically strategic it was. He did not make a film that demonstrated what he could draw. He made a film that demonstrated what he could write. The jokes in The Life of Larry were verbal as much as visual. The cutaway structure was narrative as much as comedic. The characters had relationships that implied histories and future possibilities. He was thinking about the film not as a student exercise but as a calling card. And his professor, who has not been extensively identified in public accounts, but who clearly had the good judgment to recognize what was in front of them, submitted the film to Hanna-Barbera without, apparently, asking Seth's permission first. MacFarlane would tell this story over the years with the mild amusement of someone recounting a piece of good luck that had a slightly abrupt beginning. His thesis film was sent to a major animation studio. 2 executives showed up at the senior screening. He was hired. The RISD education that led to that moment was not primarily about technical skills, though those were part of it. It was about point of view. RISD's program insisted that students develop aesthetic positions, that they make choices that reflected something specific about how they saw the world, that they not be content to reproduce styles they admired, but instead find the intersection between what they had absorbed and what they had to say. That intersection, in MacFarlane's case, was a particular vision of American family life, messy, loud, loving in an indirect way, full of cultural references that revealed the inner lives of the people making them. He graduated in May 1995 with his Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and left Providence for Los Angeles. Providence is about 45 minutes from the town of Cranston, Rhode Island, which was, according to what has been said by people associated with the show over the years, roughly the model for the fictional city of Quahog, where the Griffins would eventually live. Whether this is precisely accurate or loosely so, there is something right about it. The show that Seth MacFarlane built is deeply New England in its bones, even when it is making jokes about Los Angeles or national politics. The particular quality of working-class New England life, the slightly compressed humor, the understatement, the specific relationship between a man and his friends at a bar that is simultaneously profound and mundane, all of it runs through Family Guy in a way that was never accidental. He took it with him when he moved west, the way people take the weather they grew up in. It becomes something they cannot fully explain to people from elsewhere. The environment at Hanna-Barbera was its own education. More specifically, it was a professional education rather than an artistic one. The difference between learning to paint and learning to run a painting company. MacFarlane absorbed the rhythms of professional animation production, how long each stage took, what the relationship between writers and directors looked like, how the voice recording process worked, what happened when a script reached the animators and what they gave back. He described it as resembling an old Hollywood studio structure, and that description carries a specific implication. The old Hollywood studio system of the classical era was one where skilled people moved between projects and genres, where the studio's needs determined your assignment rather than your personal preference, where you learned by doing across a wide range. The system produced people who were generalists by necessity and specialists by inclination, who could do many things but were drawn, over time, toward the thing they did best. At Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane moved between shows. He storyboarded Dexter's Laboratory, which ran on a more visual, physical comedy sensibility. He wrote for Cow and Chicken. He spent the longest stretch on Johnny Bravo, the show whose verbal comedy gave him the most room to develop his own timing and sensibility. He has said that Johnny Bravo's scriptwriting process, where dialogue was primary and the physical animation followed from it, was the format in which he felt most at home, and it is recognizable in Family Guy's DNA. The show is fundamentally verbal. The jokes live in what characters say, in the timing of delivery, in the specific word chosen over the slightly less specific one. The animation amplifies and illustrates, but the script is the foundation. He also freelanced during this period, writing for Disney's Jungle Cubs and for Nelvana's Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. The Disney work was valuable for what it taught him about story structure. MacFarlane has described being strict about the formal elements of storytelling, the importance of character stakes, of plot points, of giving the audience a reason to care what happens next. These are not complicated principles, but they are surprisingly easy to abandon when you are caught up in making individual jokes. The discipline of keeping structure intact while also being funny is one that serious comedy writers spend years developing, and MacFarlane was doing the work of developing it. All of this, the RISD years, the Hanna-Barbera years, the Disney freelance work, the Larry Shorts, was the education, the formal one and the informal one happening simultaneously. By the time Fox gave him $50,000 and a kitchen table in 6 months, he was not a novice. He was a 24-year-old who had been preparing for this specific moment since he was 2 years old. Section 4. The Fox Pitch and the Birth of Family Guy. The deal Fox offered Seth MacFarlane in 1997, and early 1998, was strange by any standard of the television industry. Standard animated pilots at the time cost somewhere between $700,000 and $1 million to produce. Fox offered him $50,000, which was not a pilot budget. It was barely a materials budget. It was the kind of number that tells you the network was interested enough to want to see something, but not interested enough to commit real resources to finding out. MacFarlane took it anyway. He would have been foolish not to. He completed the pitch demo in approximately 6 months of sustained, nearly continuous work. The full 15-minute pilot he produced in his apartment would be formally presented to Fox on the 15th of May, 1998. It featured the first visual appearance of the Griffin family, Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian, and demonstrated the show's comedy style with enough clarity that the executives who saw it understood what they were looking at. The first 7 minutes of that pitch demo were included in Family Guy DVD sets when the show was released on home video. So many fans have seen a portion of it. But the complete 15-minute pitch pilot was considered lost media for years, a document that existed only in the memories of the people who had been present for that May 1998 screening. It was uploaded to the internet by a user named Robert Paulson in 2022, though it did not become widely viewed by the public until March 2025, when it was rediscovered and circulated online. Watching it now is an unusual experience. You are seeing the moment before, the version of the thing before it became itself, with all the creative energy of that becoming still visible on the surface. The characters are recognizable but slightly off, the way a photograph of someone when they are very young is recognizable but disorienting. Peter's voice is present but still calibrated, finding its register. Stewie and Meg exist in forms that are close but not yet final. Brian is there, sardonic and precise, already the most fully realized of the characters in terms of personality. Fox was impressed. They ordered 13 episodes. 7 of those aired during the first season. MacFarlane was offered a contract worth $2 million per season, which at the age of 24 made him one of the most financially significant young creators in American television. He has also been described as the youngest executive producer of a network television series at the time, though this is a claim that depends on how you count. At 24-25 by the time the show aired, he was certainly very young to be holding that much creative and executive authority over a primetime production. Fox was betting on him in a way that was genuinely unusual. Before we go any further into the show itself, it is worth understanding who MacFarlane had taken inspiration from in constructing the world of Family Guy, because the show that premiered on January 31, 1999 was not an isolated idea. It was a synthesis of many things that had come before, filtered through a very specific sensibility. He has cited The Simpsons as a foundational influence, which surprises nobody. But he has also spoken about All in the Family, the Norman Lear sitcom from the 1970s that had featured Archie Bunker, a bigoted working-class patriarch who was always wrong but always compelling, whose wrongness was the mechanism through which the show made its points. Peter Griffin is in some ways Archie Bunker passed through a cartoon filter, the same basic type, the man who is confidently incorrect about everything, but made more elastic by the medium, freed from the constraints of what a live actor can actually do. MacFarlane has also talked about 1980s Saturday morning cartoons as source material for the show's sensibility. Shows like The Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, and Rubik, The Amazing Cube, properties that were inherently absurd, that put famous characters in strange scenarios without particular concern for internal logic, that moved at a pace designed to capture the attention of a child watching before breakfast. The cutaway structure of Family Guy is, in its way, a descendant of that tradition. The quick pivot, the unexpected scenario, the joke that doesn't build toward a destination but arrives at one all at once. He was also, specifically and importantly, a fan of old radio. He has described listening to radio thriller anthologies from the 1930s and 1940s as a formative experience. The radio program Suspense, a drama anthology that ran from 1942 to 1962 with the tagline "Radio's Outstanding Theater of Thrills," gave the early episodes of Family Guy their distinctive episode titles, slightly ominous, slightly formal, the kind of title that suggests consequence. Death Has a Shadow. I Never Met the Dead Man. A Hero Sits Next Door. They do not sound like comedy episode titles. They sound like installments in a serial drama. That incongruity between title and content was itself a small joke, the kind that rewards attention without demanding it. The characters MacFarlane built for the show were transformations of what he had made before, but with significant additions. Peter and Brian arrived from the Larry Shorts. Lois Griffin was new. She shared a name with Larry's wife, but was an entirely different creation, given her voice by Alex Borstein, who based the accent on a cousin from Great Neck, New York, a voice that captured the particular music of East Coast upper-middle-class femininity without becoming parody. Stewie was entirely original, a concept MacFarlane had not explored before in any form. The idea of a baby who spoke with a refined British accent and planned to murder his mother and dominate the planet had no precedent in the Larry Shorts. It came from somewhere else in MacFarlane's imagination, some intersection between villain archetypes he admired and the inherent absurdity of the most helpless possible creature having the most grandiose possible ambitions. Chris was new, Meg was new. The supporting cast, Joe, Cleveland, Quagmire, these were new in their full forms, though the Larry and Steve pilot contained characters who gestured towards some of them. MacFarlane voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire himself, a decision he made because he already had clear ideas about what each voice should sound like, and felt that demonstrating those voices himself would be easier than explaining them to someone else. This was not vanity, it was efficiency. He knew exactly what Peter should sound like because Peter's voice had been building in his imagination since he overheard a security guard on the RISD campus, and no explanation he could give another actor would transmit that specificity as clearly as just doing it himself. Peter's voice is based on that security guard. The specific rhythms of it, the slightly deflated New England cadence, the way certain vowels land with a mild thud, the confidence that outstrips the intelligence, all of that came from one overheard conversation on a college campus. MacFarlane retained it with the fidelity of someone who had known from the first moment of hearing it that it was going to be useful. Stewie's voice is based on Rex Harrison, specifically Harrison's performance as Professor Henry Higgins in the 1964 film version of My Fair Lady. Harrison's Higgins is imperious, condescending, convinced of his own intellectual superiority, and capable of delivering even minor observations as though they constitute revelations. The choice to put that voice in the body of a one-year-old baby was inspired precisely because of how wrong it was. The wrongness was the point. Brian's voice is MacFarlane's own speaking voice, unmodified. This choice reveals something about how he understood the character from the beginning. Brian was meant to be the most relatable figure on the show, the one who reacted the way a person paying close attention would react. Using his own voice was a way of identifying with Brian, of putting himself inside the character, of making the most conscious and self-aware member of the Griffin household literally sound like the show's creator. Quagmire's voice was drawn from 1940s and 1950s radio commercials. The oleaginous, over-enthusiastic delivery of radio salesmen who described everything with a kind of sweaty excitement. Filtered through the character of a hypersexual airline pilot, the voice became its own distinct thing, immediately recognizable. The show Fox assembled around these characters had a budget and a production pipeline. Film Roman, the animation studio that would handle the first seasons, was brought in. A writer's room was assembled. And that writer's room, the people MacFarlane chose to work with in developing those first episodes, was its own significant story. Section 5. The Scheduling Wars and the First Cancellation. The Family Guy that premiered on the 31st of January 1999 did so in the most advantageous time slot American television can offer. Super Bowl 33 had just ended. The Denver Broncos had beaten the Atlanta Falcons 34-19 in what was a somewhat lopsided game, but the audience was enormous regardless, as Super Bowl audiences always are. When the game finished, tens of millions of people were already sitting in front of their televisions, and Family Guy was what Fox put in front of them. 22 million viewers watched that first episode, Death Has a Shadow, in which Peter loses his job at a toy factory after drinking too much at a work party, secretly applies for welfare to cover the shortfall, receives far more money than expected, and eventually drops the remaining cash from a blimp over the Super Bowl, leading to his arrest. It was a pilot that understood the form. It introduced every major character, established the comedy style, demonstrated the cutaway structure, showed the family's dynamics, and ended with Peter in legitimate trouble that his family had to rescue him from. The warmth was there, the silliness was there, the structure was there. Fox placed the show in a genuinely excellent regular slot for its first season Sunday nights at 8:30 p.m., directly between The Simpsons and The X-Files. For an animated family comedy in 1999, that position was essentially ideal. You had the audience of The Simpsons flowing in from the preceding half hour, and the audience waiting for The X-Files to follow. Family Guy was the filling in a very popular sandwich. It averaged 12.8 million households during that first season, placing it at number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings for the year. For a new animated show, those were solid numbers, not dominant but respectable and growing. The show was developing an audience. Critics were writing about it. People were talking about it at work on Monday mornings. And then Fox moved it. For the second season, Fox shifted Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. This was not a lateral move. It was a scheduling disaster. Thursday nights at 9 p.m. in the fall of 1999 meant direct competition with Frasier on NBC. Frasier was in the middle of its run as one of the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful comedies on American television, winning Emmy Award after Emmy Award, drawing audiences who were extremely loyal. Putting a new animated show against Frasier was the equivalent of asking a recently opened restaurant to compete with a neighborhood institution that had been feeding the same customers for 20 years. The ratings dropped significantly. Fox then moved Family Guy again to Tuesday nights, where it found itself in competition with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. The game show phenomenon of 1999 and 2000 is difficult to fully convey to anyone who did not live through it. Millionaire was not just popular, it was a cultural event. People who did not watch much television watched it. People organized their Tuesday evenings around it. It regularly drew between 25 and 30 million viewers, and sometimes more. Family Guy, trying to find its audience on a Tuesday night, was going up against a freight train. The pattern continued into the third season. Fox gave the show a Thursday night slot at 8 p.m., where it ran directly against Friends. At that point, in the middle of its second-to-last season, and still drawing audiences in the range of 25 million viewers, and against Survivor, the reality television phenomenon that had redefined what network audiences would watch. Family Guy was being handed slot after slot with no apparent strategic logic beyond filling the schedule, shuffled around the week without stability or promotional support. MacFarlane and others associated with the show have described the scheduling treatment as frustrating and confusing. The show was not being given an opportunity to build a consistent audience, because a consistent audience requires a consistent time and day. People who liked Family Guy were discovering repeatedly that it had moved without announcement and they were now watching something else by accident. By 2002, after the third season aired, Fox announced that Family Guy was canceled. The cancellation was clean and official. Fox published its fall lineup for 2002, and Family Guy was not on it. The show had simply been dropped. What happened next was not simple at all. Fox attempted to sell the rerun rights to Family Guy to cable networks. This is standard practice. A canceled show's library has value, and networks that own that library typically want to recoup some of their production costs by licensing reruns. What was not standard was what Fox found when it tried to sell. There was almost no interest. The show had been canceled, the rights were cheap, and the general industry consensus was that it was simply not worth buying. Almost no interest. The qualifier matters here. Cartoon Network purchased the rights, according to what the president of 20th Century Fox Television said publicly at the time, basically for free. They gave almost nothing for a library of shows that had cost millions of dollars to produce. The shows were put into the Adult Swim programming block, the late-night programming on Cartoon Network that had been running since 2001 and was dedicated to programming aimed at an older demographic, the college students and young adults who were awake at midnight and looking for something on television that wasn't the local news. Family Guy premiered in reruns on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003. And something extraordinary happened. The show immediately became the highest-rated program on the entire block. Not the highest-rated program it had competed with, not the highest-rated program in its time period, the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim network. It dominated late-night viewing against both cable and broadcast competition in its time slot and boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. That number is not a rounding error. A canceled show purchased for almost nothing was increasing the audience of the network airing it by nearly 2.5 times. At the same time, Fox released the DVD sets for Family Guy's first and second seasons. The timing was not coincidental. Fox had noticed the Adult Swim numbers and understood that there was an audience out there that was actively seeking the show out. The DVDs were priced attractively and promoted effectively, and they sold. They sold in numbers that the home video market had not seen for a television series in recent memory. The first season and second season sets sold more than 2.2 million copies combined, making them the best-selling television DVD releases of 2002 and the second highest-selling television DVD releases of all time up to that point, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show. When DVD sales reached 3 million copies, Fox took notice in a way that could no longer be ignored. The network had canceled a show, practically given away its rights, watched another network turn those rights into a ratings phenomenon, and simultaneously watched millions of people voluntarily purchase the show in a format they could own and watch whenever they chose. The mathematics of this situation told a very clear story. By 2004, Fox made the decision to bring Family Guy back. This was, by general consensus, the first time in American television history that a show had been revived by the same network that had canceled it, driven specifically by DVD sales proving the existence of a passionate audience. It set a precedent that would influence how the industry thought about canceled shows and home video markets for years afterward. The announcement was greeted with genuine enthusiasm from the fan base that had gathered around the show during its Adult Swim run. People who had been watching reruns at midnight, people who had bought the DVDs and lent them to friends, people who had simply missed the show and found themselves surprised by how much they had missed it, all of them were now going to get new episodes. MacFarlane had not expected this to happen. He has said so. He described the return as something that required a network to be willing to say it had made a mistake, and that kind of institutional admission was almost unheard of. He was grateful. He was also, by this point, in the middle of co-creating American Dad with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, two writers who had come from the Family Guy staff and who had developed a new show with MacFarlane during the years of cancellation. American Dad would premiere in February 2005, just a few months before Family Guy returned for its fourth season in May. MacFarlane was simultaneously running two primetime animated shows on the same network. He was 31 years old. The version of Family Guy that came back in 2005 was not quite identical to the one that had left in 2002. 3 years had passed. The writing staff had scattered during the cancellation, and not all of them had come back. New writers had been brought in. The show looked slightly different. The animation, now handled by different studios, had a cleaner but less expressive quality. The characters would begin, gradually, to shift in ways that would only become more pronounced as the seasons accumulated. But in the spring of 2005, none of that was visible yet. The return was a celebration. A show had come back from the dead because its audience had refused to let it stay buried. That was the story, and it was a genuinely remarkable one. Section 6 Adult Swim, the DVD revolution, and why Family Guy changed everything. To fully appreciate what happened to Family Guy between 2002 and 2005, you have to understand what Adult Swim was and what it meant. Cartoon Network had launched in 1992 as a cable channel dedicated to animation. It was initially built on the library of classic Hanna-Barbera programming, the Looney Tunes, the old Warner Brothers catalogs, the very shows that Seth MacFarlane had grown up watching and absorbing. By the late 1990s, the network had moved into original programming with considerable success, developing shows like Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and The Powerpuff Girls that had redefined what children's animation could look like. Adult Swim launched in September 2001, occupying the late-night hours on Cartoon Network from 11 p.m. onward. The programming block was targeted explicitly at adult viewers in their late teens, 20s, and 30s, the people who had grown up on Cartoon Network and were now old enough that children's programming no longer felt right, but who still had a relationship with animation as a medium. The shows Adult Swim developed for itself were strange. Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. These were not conventional comedies. They were experimental, low budget, and weird in ways that felt deliberate and purposeful rather than accidental. The aesthetic was one of late-night television seen through a slightly distorted lens, as though the act of watching at midnight was itself part of the joke. Family Guy arrived on Adult Swim in April 2003, and it was different from everything else in the lineup. It had a production quality that the Adult Swim originals, with their minimal budgets, did not have. It had a cast of characters who were fully realized and who existed in relationship with each other rather than in the more fragmentary, sketch-like mode of shows like Aqua Teen. And it was deeply funny in a way that landed with the late-night audience precisely because it had not been built for late-night television. It was primetime television being watched at midnight, and there was something both comforting and slightly subversive about that. The audience that discovered Family Guy on Adult Swim was largely composed of young people, high school and college students, young professionals, people who were night owls by temperament or schedule. These were also, crucially, people who were early adopters of the internet. The mid-2000s were the beginning of the era of online video sharing. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned for its fourth season. But even before YouTube, Clips were being shared through early file-sharing platforms and embedded in forums and websites. Family Guy's cutaway gags were ideally suited to this mode of distribution. A 30-second clip of Peter doing something absurd or Stewie plotting something elaborate could be extracted from an episode, shared digitally, and viewed by someone who had never seen a full episode and might not even know what show it was from. The cutaway gag, which was an innovation when McFarlane introduced it into a primetime animated format, there was also, though, nobody could have predicted this in 1999, perfectly engineered for the era of social media and short-form video sharing that would arrive in the years following the show's return. The self-contained joke that exists independently of context, that is funny without requiring you to know anything about the characters or the plot, that can be experienced in 30 seconds and shared immediately. This is what a Family Guy cutaway is. The internet didn't change Family Guy. The internet revealed what Family Guy had always been, a clip machine assembled inside a show. The DVD phenomenon was equally significant in what it revealed about the relationship between audiences and content. The conventional wisdom of the television industry in the late 1990s and early 2000s was that audiences watched television when it was on, and if they missed something, they waited for a rerun. DVDs changed this fundamentally. A DVD set was not a rerun. It was ownership. The buyer could watch an episode when they wanted, as many times as they wanted, in whatever sequence they chose. They could watch a season in 2 days or spread it over 6 months. They could share the discs with a friend or lend them to a family member. The relationship between the viewer and the content was no longer mediated by a broadcast schedule. Family Guy on DVD became a social object. People who had the disc sets were lending them to people who didn't. You would watch an episode with someone who had never seen the show and watch them laugh and then hand them the box and say, "Keep it for the weekend." That kind of organic distribution, driven by genuine enthusiasm rather than marketing, was exactly what the Adult Swim numbers had already suggested, that there was an audience for this show that the original Fox broadcast, hampered by constant scheduling changes, had never been allowed to find. The numbers that Fox saw when they looked at Adult Swim ratings and DVD sales in 2003 and 2004 were not numbers that told them a moderately popular show had a decent following. They were numbers that told them they had canceled something people actually loved, and that love had survived and grown in the absence of new episodes. That is a rare thing in television. Shows that are merely popular tend to fade when the new episodes stop coming. Shows that inspire genuine attachment persist and sometimes grow stronger. Family Guy had inspired genuine attachment. What the Adult Swim revival also demonstrated was something more specific. The demographic that loved Family Guy was young, male-skewing, digitally engaged, and exactly the kind of audience that advertisers paid premiums to reach. The show had been canceled when its ratings were being destroyed by scheduling decisions, not when its audience had stopped caring. The audience had never stopped caring. They had just been unable to find the show on Thursday nights against Frasier and Millionaire. The return of Family Guy in May 2005 was therefore not a second debut, it was a correction. The show that had been denied a fair chance to find its audience was now being given the time slot it should have had from the beginning Sunday nights, after The Simpsons, in the animation domination lineup that Fox was constructing as a deliberate programming block. And alongside Family Guy's return, American Dad debuted in February, 2 months earlier. Seth MacFarlane was now the anchor of Fox's Sunday night animated programming, the creator most central to the network's identity in that genre. The scale of what had happened between 1999 and 2005 is worth sitting with for a moment. A show premiered to 22 million viewers, struggled for 3 seasons under terrible scheduling conditions, was canceled and given away for almost nothing, was turned into the most-watched show on a cable network, sold millions of DVDs, and returned to its original network as the centerpiece of a primetime block. None of the standard rules of television applied. DVD sales had never driven a revival before. A canceled show had never been rescued by a competitor network's rerun numbers before. An audience had never made a show come back from the dead by simply refusing to forget it before. Family Guy was the first time all of these things happened. And they happened because the show, whatever its eventual trajectory, had connected with people in a way that simple ratings numbers had not captured and the traditional industry machinery had not been equipped to measure. The story of Family Guy's first cancellation and return is, among other things, a story about the gap between what the television industry thought audiences wanted and what audiences actually wanted. The industry thought audiences wanted stability and prestige. Audiences, in this case, wanted to laugh at a family in Rhode Island doing ridiculous things, and they wanted it badly enough to prove it with their own money. Section 7. What made the early show work? Before examining everything that the show became and where its origins led, it is worth spending some time in the place where everything was good. Because the early seasons of Family Guy were genuinely excellent television, and the reasons they were excellent tell you more about Seth MacFarlane's intentions than any amount of analysis of the later years can. Seasons 1 through 3 of Family Guy, the original pre-cancellation run, have a quality that is difficult to precisely name but immediately recognizable when you encounter it. The word that comes closest is heart. The show had heart. That sounds like a soft description, the kind of thing said about greeting cards rather than adult animated comedies that made jokes about the Catholic Church and deliberately offensive cultural stereotypes. But it is accurate. The Griffins in those early seasons were a family. Not in the technical sense of being related characters who shared a house, in the meaningful sense of being people who loved each other in the particular way that real families do, which involves simultaneous exasperation and devotion. The specific texture of relationships built over years of shared meals and arguments and forgiven offenses. Peter in Season 1 is dumb, in a way that is not simply a character trait for comedy purposes, but a window into something more sympathetic. He does not understand many things. He misreads situations constantly. He causes problems through his actions with the breezy confidence of someone who has not yet processed the existence of consequences. And yet, at the end of episodes, when things have gone wrong and needed to be fixed, he apologizes. He goes to Lois and tells her he loves her. He hugs his kids. He learns things, not always the right things, not always permanently, but he learns. The early Peter is a good man who happens to be really quite stupid, and the combination is endearing rather than repellent. This distinction matters enormously in comedy. There is a type of comedy built around characters who are bad people, selfish, cruel, self-aware in their selfishness, and this type of comedy can work very well when executed with precision. But it requires the audience to remain at a certain distance from the characters, to appreciate the mechanics of the comedy without being invited to care about the people performing it. A separate type of comedy is built around characters who are good people making bad decisions, and this type requires the audience to care. The comedy is funnier because we are worried about the characters even as we are laughing at them. Early Family Guy was firmly the second type. Peter was a good person making bad decisions. Brian was a good person with good intentions who was also a failed writer and sometimes drank too much. Stewie was planning to murder his mother, which is not a good person quality, but the comedy of Stewie worked because his grandiosity was absurd against his actual helplessness. He needed his diaper changed between world domination plots, and Lois had no idea any of it was happening. The characters balanced each other in a way that felt deliberate and carefully constructed. Peter and Brian were a version of the classic comedy duo, the fool and the straight man, the one who makes everything worse and the one who observes this happening. Their friendship was specific and detailed. Brian cared about Peter even when Peter was being impossible. Peter valued Brian even when he didn't fully understand him. The dynamic between them was the emotional core of the show in those first seasons, more so than the marriage between Peter and Lois, more so than any of the family dynamics. Stewie's relationship with Brian was beginning to develop during this period as well. Brian was one of the few characters who seemed to actually hear Stewie when he spoke, and their interactions had a quality of genuine connection that would later become the most emotionally resonant storyline the show ever produced. The humor in seasons 1 through 3 was also structurally different from what the show would become. The cutaway gags were present from the very first episode, but they were used sparingly and with intention. They added to the comedy rather than replacing it. You could remove every cutaway from a season 1 episode and still have a complete, funny story. The cutaways were the garnish on a meal that was already good without them. The writing room MacFarlane assembled for those first seasons was full of people who would go on to significant careers. Chris Sheridan, who wrote some of the most character-driven stories of the early run, Danny Smith, who specialized in the kind of absurd cutaway gags that amplified the show's non-sequitur style, Gary Janetti, who later created his own shows and became a prominent figure in fashion and entertainment writing, Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan, who would leave Family Guy to become writers and eventually executive producers on NBC's Scrubs. Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, who would leave to co-create American Dad. These people brought distinct sensibilities to the table. MacFarlane has said that the original writers of the show came primarily from live-action sitcoms rather than animation, which gave the writing a grounded quality, a sense of character, consequence, and emotional logic that purely animation-trained writers might not have brought. The characters behaved like people even when they were doing impossible things. The impossible things were funny partly because the characters themselves seemed to find them as confusing as we did. The show also had an unusual quality of patience in its comedy. Not every joke was delivered at the same pace. Some cutaways were quick in and out in 5 seconds, a flash of absurdity before returning to the story. Others were allowed to breathe, to build, to arrive at their punchline through a slightly longer path. The variation in rhythm kept the viewer's attention in a way that constant speed joke delivery does not. The early episodes also had proper 3-act structures. Episodes began with a setup, developed a complication, and resolved it in a way that felt satisfying. The resolution was often comedic rather than dramatically genuine, but it was a resolution. The Griffin family, by the end of a season 1 episode, was usually in roughly the same place they had started, but the audience had been on a journey that felt complete. This completeness, the sense that an episode had a beginning, a middle, and an end, that the characters in it had moved through something, is what the phrase well-crafted episode actually means. It is surprisingly rare. It requires sustained attention from the writers through every stage of the story, not just at the pitch stage when the idea sounds good, not just at the joke stage when the cutaways are being assembled, but at every step of the structure. MacFarlane in those early seasons was providing that attention, or ensuring that the writers around him were providing it. The show was also specific about Rhode Island in ways that gave it a kind of ground. The fictional setting of Quahog was modeled, loosely, on Cranston, Rhode Island, which is a real city near Providence. The show did not pretend it was set in a generic American suburb. It existed in a specific place with specific cultural associations. New England working class, Irish American Catholic, the particular relationship between the bar and the neighborhood that characterizes certain communities in that part of the country. Peter's friends at the Drunken Clam had a specific quality to their friendship, grounded in that cultural context. All of this was the product of a creator who was making something personal. MacFarlane had grown up in Connecticut. He had gone to college in Rhode Island. The world he was building on screen was not a fantasy world or a generic America. It was a specific place filtered through his specific experience of the New England working class, its humor, its loyalties, its particular brand of warmth that often looks like severity from the outside. That specificity is what gave the early show its texture. It is also what tends to erode first when a show's creative center begins to shift. The specific becomes the generic, the personal becomes the professional, and the texture smooths out into something more easily reproduced. But in those first 3 seasons, the texture was fully present. Family Guy was doing something that very few shows of any type managed to do. It was being simultaneously broad enough for a large audience and specific enough to feel like something that could only have come from one particular person's imagination. Section 8. The characters who were born from nothing. To understand what Seth MacFarlane actually built when he built Family Guy, you have to understand each of these characters as he designed them, not as they would eventually become, but as they were intended to be, as they were in those first episodes when every choice was still deliberate and every element was still in service of a vision. Peter Griffin arrived from the Larry Shorts, but he was also a composite of something larger. He carried the voice of the Rhode Island security guard MacFarlane had overheard at RISD, a voice that suggested a specific type of man, not educated in the formal sense, but not unintelligent either, smart in the ways that came from living in the world and paying attention to the wrong things in it. Loud in the way that people become when they are deeply certain about things they have not fully examined. Fundamentally decent in the way that most people are when the fundamental decency is not being tested by anything particularly serious. The Peter of those early seasons was modeled partly on Archie Bunker's working-class father archetype and partly on the tradition of the bumbling husband that stretches back through Jackie Gleason's Ralph Cramden in The Honeymooners all the way to the basic structural role of the lovable fool in comedy. But MacFarlane added something specific to Peter, a genuine emotional life. Peter felt things. He felt them imprecisely and expressed them clumsily, but he felt them. His love for Lois was real. His pride in his children was real, even when it led him to embarrass them spectacularly. The fact that he would eventually forget his daughter's name was not part of the design. In season 1, Peter knew Meg existed. He had opinions about her. He was, in his way, her father. Lois Griffin was given a voice by Alex Borstein that she based on a cousin from Great Neck, New York, a voice that carried the specific music of a certain kind of East Coast American woman, educated, slightly ironic, capable of warmth, and also of a sharp word when warmth wasn't working. Lois was written in the early seasons as genuinely competent. She was the person who held the family together, not through maternal superpowers, but through attention and effort. She noticed things. She followed up. She loved Peter with the kind of love that requires ongoing decisions to love someone despite their persistent worst qualities, which is the kind of love that is actually impressive rather than effortless. Lois was also crucially funny on her own terms. She was not purely a straight woman to Peter's buffoonery. She had desires that surprised the audience, a gambling addiction revealed in season 1, a kleptomania phase, hints of a past that was more interesting than the suburban present. She was a fully realized person with her own inner life, which made her believable as someone Peter would have chosen. Stewie was the most original invention, the character with no precedent. The British accent came from Rex Harrison's Professor Higgins in My Fair Lady. That particular combination of condescension and precision, the absolute conviction that one is the most intelligent person in any room, delivered with theatrical exactness. MacFarlane took that voice and put it in the body of an infant, then gave the infant a laboratory in his bedroom, a collection of weapons, and a burning ambition to murder his mother and establish global dominance. The comedy of Stewie in those early seasons worked on at least 3 simultaneous levels. There was the obvious absurdity of the premise, a baby who built laser guns. There was the more subtle comedy of the dramatic irony, the fact that Lois was completely unaware of what was happening in the crib she had assembled with such care. And there was the deepest level, which was the existential comedy of something completely helpless, having completely ungovernable ambitions. Stewie could not walk down a flight of stairs without assistance, but he could monologue at length about the toppling of human civilization. The gap between what he was capable of and what he wanted to accomplish was itself a kind of poetry. Brian, as already noted, used MacFarlane's own voice. This was a choice that had implications beyond the practical. Brian was, in some ways, MacFarlane's most self-reflective creation, the character through whom the creator's own anxieties and aspirations could be expressed. A writer who had not finished his novel, someone who drank more than was good for him, a person who wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual but whose actual behavior often undermined this aspiration. A creature who moved between the human world and something beneath it, who could join the dinner table but was also, occasionally, distracted by a tennis ball. Brian was the most human character on a show full of humans, and the fact that he was a dog was one of those inversions that comedy loves. The dog is more civilized than the people. The dog reads. The dog has opinions about Hemingway. The dog drinks a good martini and can explain why it's good. The people around him are chaotic and impulsive and emotional in all the wrong directions. The dog is the only one paying attention. The supporting cast was equally carefully constructed. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer voiced by Patrick Warburton, was introduced in Season 1 as someone the neighborhood admired, capable, tough, respected. Peter was jealous of Joe initially, which positioned Joe as a figure of aspirational masculinity, someone who had achieved a kind of effectiveness that Peter recognized and wanted. The wheelchair was not a punchline in the early seasons. It was simply part of who Joe was, a detail that made him more specific without making him reducible to that detail. Cleveland Brown, voiced by Mike Henry, was the most understated member of the friend group, gentle and considered in a way that contrasted with Joe's physical intensity and Peter's recklessness. He was, of the 4 friends, the one most likely to notice when something was wrong and say something quietly about it. His gentleness was not a weakness. It was its own kind of strength, the particular strength of someone who does not feel the need to be loud about what they know. Glenn Quagmire, voiced by MacFarlane in a delivery drawn from 1940s radio commercials, was a hypersexual airline pilot whose comedy was the comedy of total commitment to a single impulse. Quagmire wanted what he wanted with an enthusiasm that was simultaneously appalling and somehow infectious. In the early seasons, even Quagmire had a quality of innocence. His appetites were extreme, but they were also somehow cheerful, the appetites of someone for whom desire was a kind of vitality rather than a dysfunction. Meg was the normal one, and this was the point. In a family with a reckless father, a piano-teaching mother with a complicated past, a baby who was building weapons and plotting murder, and a talking dog, the oldest child who just wanted to fit in at high school was the most relatable person on the show. Her unpopularity was a form of relatability. Most people have felt, at some point in their lives, like the least interesting person in a very interesting room. Meg in Season 1 was that feeling given a character. Chris, voiced by Seth Green in a delivery inspired by the criminal Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, which sounds disturbing but resulted in something genuinely funny, was the slightly dimmer, younger version of Peter. He had Peter's good nature and Peter's lack of self-awareness, but without the years of accumulated wrong decisions. He was a teenager who was going to grow up to be Peter, and the comedy of that was gentle rather than bleak. These characters, assembled together, formed something more than the sum of their parts. They formed a system of relationships that generated comedy by friction and generated warmth by connection. When the system was working, you could feel it. The jokes were funnier because you cared about the people making them. The emotional moments were more affecting because the comedy had made you trust the characters. This is the thing that is hardest to describe about why the early Family Guy worked, and hardest to achieve in practice. It required keeping track of all these relationships simultaneously, maintaining their integrity while also pushing them into comic extremes, never letting the extremes destroy the underlying coherence. MacFarlane was doing this in those first 3 seasons. He was keeping all the plates spinning at once, and it looked effortless from the outside. It was not effortless. Nothing like that ever is. Section 9. The Writer's Room and the Minds Behind the Magic. The writer's room of Family Guy in its first season was a particular kind of environment. Small, pressed together, physically located in an office that had been lent to them by the King of the Hill production crew, because Family Guy as a new show had not yet established its own dedicated space. The Family Guy writers in 1998 and 1999 were working in borrowed territory, which is a condition that can either be humbling or galvanizing, and in this case, appears to have been galvanizing. MacFarlane had assembled a group of writers, as noted earlier, that included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. What is notable about this group, beyond the talent it would demonstrably contain, is a quality MacFarlane himself has emphasized in discussions of the show's origins. Almost none of these writers had worked in animation before. They were coming from live-action sitcoms. This detail matters more than it might initially seem to. Animation writing and live-action sitcom writing have overlapping skills but divergent orientations. A live-action writer thinks about what actors can do, about the specific timing of a performer in a space, about the constraints of a real location and a real camera. An animation writer thinks about what a drawing can do, which is in some ways unlimited and in other ways more abstract. You cannot create intimacy with a close-up the same way in animation that you can in live action, because animation has to construct that intimacy through other means, through the rhythm of dialogue and the expressiveness of character design. When live-action writers bring their habits to animation, the result is often a show that thinks of its characters more fully as people than as drawings that cares about motivation, about emotional consistency, about what a character would actually feel and do in a given situation. The early Family Guy episodes have this quality. The characters behave in ways that feel internally consistent with who they are supposed to be, even when they are doing impossible things. They react to absurdity the way people would react to absurdity, even when they are cartoons. The writing process MacFarlane established in those early seasons involved the full staff of writers working on scripts collaboratively. A script would be written by one writer and then distributed to the rest of the room. Cutaway gags were pitched by everyone and filtered through MacFarlane. The ones he found funniest were kept, the others were dropped. The system was essentially a collective refinement process, with MacFarlane's taste functioning as the final filter. This is a very particular kind of creative authority, and it requires a very particular kind of creator to exercise it well. MacFarlane had to be able to evaluate other writers' jokes honestly, without ego, without dismissing things that were good because they were not his, and without including things that were not good because he did not want to embarrass the writer who had pitched them. He also had to maintain a consistent vision for the tone and style of the show across every episode, regardless of which writer was the credited author of a given script. He described his own influences in those years with a specificity that reveals how consciously he was drawing on sources. Frank Sinatra's musical phrasing influenced how he thought about comedic timing. The pause before the note held slightly longer than expected, the sense that timing is the thing that makes a good idea great versus merely good. The rhythm of 1930s and 1940s radio drama, with its theatrical suspense and its architectural episode titles, gave the show a structural sensibility that set it apart from other animated comedies. The Simpsons gave him permission to be satirical about American culture in a sustained way. All in the Family gave him the working-class patriarch as a complex rather than a simply comic figure. But the synthesis was his. None of these individual influences would have produced Family Guy without the particular person doing the synthesizing. Several of the original writers have spoken, in the years since, about the experience of that early writing room as one of genuine creative excitement. The show was new. It was doing things that had not been done before in animated prime time. The stakes felt real in the way that new creative endeavors always feel real before they become established, and the risk recedes. Everyone in that room knew they were making something original, and originality is its own kind of fuel. Chris Sheridan, who would become one of the show's most consistent voices through the early seasons and into the revival, focused particularly on the character-driven stories, the episodes where what happened mattered because of who the characters were and what they meant to each other, rather than primarily as delivery systems for jokes. His work is visible in the episodes that have stayed with viewers across decades, the ones that managed to be funny and somehow moving at the same time. Danny Smith was the specialist of the absurd cutaway, the lateral move, the connection that makes no logical sense but is somehow immediately recognizable as funny, the joke that could not have been arrived at through deliberate construction, but that feels, in retrospect, inevitable. His instinct for non sequitur was valuable in a show that was building its own distinctive comedic vocabulary around the unexpected juxtaposition. Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan, who would leave together eventually to join Scrubs and become executive producers there, brought a sensibility shaped by that particular era of NBC comedy: smart, fast, emotionally grounded, with a willingness to let a joke carry genuine feeling rather than deflecting from it. Their presence in the early Family Guy writing room explains some of the show's willingness in those seasons to be sincere, to let an episode end on something real rather than deflecting into irony at the last moment. Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, who would create American Dad, were establishing in the Family Guy writing room the instincts that would later produce a show with considerably different structural choices, fewer cutaways, more sustained storytelling, characters who were allowed to grow across seasons rather than resetting at the end of each episode. You can see them working through ideas in their Family Guy scripts that they would eventually take further in the show they made themselves. The room also had, particularly in those first seasons, a willingness to disagree and argue. MacFarlane has not described the early writing process as entirely harmonious. Creative excellence rarely emerges from pure harmony. The arguments were productive in the way that arguments between people who care about the same thing are productive. They surface the actual choices being made, force decisions that complacency would leave unmade, and result in something that is the product of genuine consideration rather than default. MacFarlane was, in those years, deeply present in every stage of the show's production. He was writing scripts. He was voicing 4 main characters. He was in the recording sessions. He was reviewing the animation. He was the creative center around which everything else organized itself, and his involvement was not nominal. The show felt like it came from a specific person because it did. This is what was at stake in the cancellation of 2002, though nobody fully understood it at the time. When the show went away, MacFarlane went away from it. Not from animation generally, he was co-developing American Dad during the years of Family Guy's absence, but from the specific daily creative labor of making Family Guy. And when the show came back in 2005, it came back to a writing room that had been reassembled from scratch, with different people carrying different sensibilities, and with MacFarlane slightly less present than he had been before. The show that returned in 2005 was recognizably Family Guy, but it was beginning, in ways that would take several more seasons to become fully visible, to drift from the version of Family Guy that existed in Seth MacFarlane's original imagination. Section 10: The Bigger World. Seth built American Dad, The Orville, and Beyond. Understanding Seth MacFarlane requires understanding that Family Guy was never his only project, and was, from a relatively early point in its existence, not even his primary one. He is a person with a remarkably wide range of creative interests and an unusual capacity for executing across multiple formats, simultaneously animated television, live-action film, music, science documentary production, and latterly live-action television drama. American Dad came directly from the cancellation of Family Guy. During the 3 years between Family Guy's second cancellation and its revival, MacFarlane worked with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman to develop an entirely new animated sitcom. The show premiered in February 2005, just months before Family Guy's return for its fourth season, and it was constructed on different principles from its predecessor. The Smith family was centered on Stan Smith, a CIA agent who was intensely patriotic to the point of zealotry, convinced that his worldview was correct in a way that the show was explicitly designed to satirize. His wife Francine was warmer and more impulsive. Their daughter Haley was politically opposite to Stan, which generated ongoing friction. Their son Steve was awkward and nerdy in the way of teenage boys who are slightly outside the center of social gravity. Living in their attic was Roger, an extraterrestrial alien who had been recovered by the CIA and who had the ability to adopt personas, becoming entirely different characters with different names and backstories for essentially any episode the writers wanted to do. And the family fish, Klaus, contained the transplanted mind of an East German Olympic ski jumper, which is a detail that should be absurd but somehow becomes simply part of the furniture of the show. American Dad did not use cutaway gags. This was a deliberate choice, and its effects were profound. Without cutaways as a fallback, every episode of American Dad had to work as a complete story. The comedy had to emerge from the characters and their situations rather than from tangential sketches inserted into the narrative. The writing room had to be better storytellers because they had closed off the escape route. The result was a show that developed its characters across seasons in a way Family Guy increasingly did not. Stan Smith started as a one-note political caricature and became, over many seasons, a genuinely complex character still wrong about most things, still capable of spectacular failures of judgment, but also demonstrably capable of learning, of love, of the kind of growth that requires acknowledging you were wrong. The show built season arcs. Characters had histories that accumulated and affected how later episodes played. Relationships changed and were allowed to stay changed. Roger the alien, through his persona concept, became one of the most creatively flexible characters in animated television. Each new persona was effectively a new character, with its own comedy style and its own relationship to the existing cast. This meant the show was never locked into the same 3 or 4 comedic modes. It had an infinite supply of new materials available to it, accessed through a device that was internal to the show's logic rather than imposed from outside. MacFarlane has spoken about The Orville, his science fiction dramedy that premiered on Fox in 2017 and moved to Hulu in 2022 as perhaps his most personally meaningful project. The show is set aboard a mid-level exploratory spaceship in a future Federation-like organization, and it draws explicitly on the traditions of Star Trek while doing something distinct from them. The show's tone is unusual. It is neither pure comedy nor pure drama, but something in between, episodes that can be genuinely funny in one moment and then take a sudden turn into something that requires emotional engagement. MacFarlane created The Orville in part as a response to what he saw as a gap in science fiction television. The optimistic, ensemble-focused, adventure-driven space story that Star Trek had been in its classic incarnations had largely disappeared from television, replaced by darker, more cynical visions of the future. The Orville was his attempt to fill that gap, to make science fiction that believed in the possibility of human progress, that trusted its characters to solve problems through intelligence and decency rather than through violence and sacrifice. He also used The Orville as a vehicle for social commentary in a way that differed from Family Guy. The Orville addressed topics like gender identity, democratic backsliding, addiction, and cultural relativism through the distance of science fiction metaphor, the same way classic Star Trek had addressed Vietnam and civil rights through alien allegories. The commentary was pointed, but the genre distance allowed it to be received without the reflexive defensiveness that direct political content often triggers. McFarlane's music career runs parallel to all of this. He has released 9 studio albums of material drawn from the Great American Songbook, the catalog of classic American popular music from the 1920s through the 1960s, the Sinatra and Dean Martin and Bing Crosby repertoire he had absorbed as a child in Kent, Connecticut. He has performed at Carnegie Hall in New York and the Royal Albert Hall in London. He has been nominated for Grammy Awards. He has collaborated with Norah Jones and Sarah Bareilles and other artists of entirely different generations who found common ground in arrangements built around orchestras rather than synthesizers. He describes the music as a passion rather than a career calculation, which is probably accurate given that his primary career as a producer and showrunner would not require him to also release jazz standards to remain successful. It is something he does because it genuinely matters to him, because the orchestration of a full big band doing something precise and beautiful satisfies something in him that other forms of creative expression do not. He produced Cosmos, a space-time odyssey, the 2014 continuation of Carl Sagan's legendary science documentary series, hosted by astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. His involvement in the project was financial and logistical, as much as creative. He helped secure the studio support for the series that allowed it to be made, but it also reflected a genuine commitment to science communication that has been consistent across his career. McFarlane is a strong advocate for scientific literacy and rational inquiry, positions that surface in his work in various forms, from Brian Griffin's atheism on Family Guy to the explicit philosophical content of The Orville. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013, an appearance that was remembered for both its comedy and its controversies, including a musical number that drew criticism for its treatment of women. McFarlane received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2019 and was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame in 2020. His production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, has been the creative engine behind all of these projects. His mother, Anne, died of cancer in 2010. Her death was acknowledged publicly and touched many people who had followed McFarlane's career. The death of a parent changes something fundamental in a person, and in McFarlane's case, it came at a moment when his professional life was at its most expansive and his private life was, by his own accounts, somewhat less settled. He has spoken across the years about difficulty in sustaining romantic relationships, attributing this partly to the demands of a career that requires extraordinary investments of time and attention. He has remained unmarried. The 2020 deal with NBC Universal, worth a reported $200 million over 5 years, moved McFarlane's production home away from Fox's parent company and into Comcast's broader entertainment network. The Orville moved to Hulu. New projects were developed for Peacock, including a prequel series to Ted the 2012 film about a living teddy bear that had grossed over $500 million worldwide and which McFarlane wrote, directed, produced, starred in, and voiced the bear for. A level of creative control that is unusual even by the standards of people with extraordinary creative control. All of this coexisted with Family Guy, which kept going on Fox regardless of where McFarlane's professional center of gravity was in any given year. He had stopped writing for the show by 2010, by his own admission in a 2017 Reddit interview where he said he had not written for it since that year. He continued to voice the characters, which meant he was present in the recording studio for every episode, but the creative decisions about story and character were being made by other people. The relationship between the show and its creator had, by the middle years of the show's run, become something closer to an ongoing professional obligation than a creative passion. Not because McFarlane had stopped caring about Family Guy, but because his definition of what caring about it required had shifted from active creative stewardship to something more supervisory and more distant. Section 11. The Legacy, the Controversies, and Why the Show Keeps Going. Family Guy has existed for more than 25 years now, spanning a period of American cultural history that includes the September 11 attacks, 2 financial crises, 4 different presidential administrations, the rise of social media, the streaming revolution, the Me Too movement, a global pandemic, and the complete transformation of how people watch television. The show has navigated all of this with varying degrees of grace, drawing praise and condemnation in roughly equal measure across the span, and continuing to produce episodes regardless of either. The controversies that have attached to Family Guy across its run are too numerous to fully catalog, but their general character can be described. The show has drawn criticism from conservative groups for its treatment of religion, from progressive groups for its treatment of race and gender, from disability advocates for its handling of Joe Swanson's wheelchair, from grief and mental health communities for its sometimes cavalier treatment of death and trauma. The Parents Television Council, which evaluates broadcast content for family suitability, placed the show on its list of worst primetime programs for family viewing multiple times in 2000, 2005, and 2006. The Federal Communications Commission received complaints and petitions requesting that the show be blocked from broadcasting. MacFarlane's response to these criticisms has been consistent and relatively uncomplicated. He believes in the right of adult-oriented programming to treat mature subjects with the kind of comedy that can be both offensive and illuminating, that the offense is sometimes the point, and that comedy has historically been one of the most effective vehicles for challenging ideas that power would prefer go unchallenged. He is not apologetic about making the show he made. He is, as he has described it, in the tradition of provocative comedy, Mel Brooks, the Zucker-Abraham Zucker team, the original All in the Family, in which nothing is sacred not because nothing matters, but because humor is the instrument through which things that matter too much to confront directly can be approached. The Emmy nomination in 2009 was the clearest official recognition of Family Guy's standing as a serious creative achievement. In that year, the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences nominated the show for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first time an animated program had received that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961. The Flintstones comparison is instructive. That show, which premiered in 1960, was the first animated primetime sitcom, the groundbreaker that proved animated television could reach adult audiences in evening programming. Nearly 50 years later, Family Guy was being recognized in the same category, which positioned it as the heir to that tradition, the show that, like the Flintstones, had expanded what animated primetime television could be and mean. TV Guide, in 2013, ranked Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. The ranking placed it in genuinely distinguished company. The list included Looney Tunes and The Simpsons and Peanuts and other properties that had been defining American animated culture for generations. Whatever criticisms could be leveled at the show, and many could, its impact on animation and on popular culture was not in question. The ratings decline that began after the show's 4th season return and continued, episode by episode and season by season, into the 2020s tells a complicated story. From the 7.9 million viewers of Season 4's premiere to the 723,000 viewers of Season 23's average, a loss of more than 90% of the audience. The numbers suggest a show that had been losing its connection with viewers for a sustained period, but the numbers tell only part of the story, because the television landscape itself changed radically during the same period. The rise of streaming services, time-shifted viewing, and the fragmentation of the audience across hundreds of channels and platforms means that broadcast ratings from 2024 cannot be compared directly to broadcast ratings from 2005 as though they measure the same thing. A show drawing 700,000 live viewers in 2024 has an audience that is also watching the show on Hulu, sharing clips on TikTok, discovering it through YouTube compilations, and encountering it in streaming libraries. The live television number is only one slice of a much larger audience. Family Guy is, according to multiple reports, one of the most watched shows on Hulu. It is the second most viewed show on that platform, behind Saturday Night Live. Clips from the show circulate constantly on social media, generating millions of views from people who may or may not be watching the episodes themselves. The show's cultural presence in 2025 is not accurately reflected by its Wednesday night broadcast ratings, any more than the show's cultural presence in 2003 was accurately reflected by the Fox ratings that had caused its cancellation. The April 2025 announcement that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons through season 27 and into the 2028 to 2029 television season coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary, confirmed that, from Fox's, now Disney's, perspective, the commercial case for continuing the show remains intact. At 15 episodes per season, the show is cost-effective relative to live-action production, valuable in streaming libraries, and part of a recognizable brand that moves merchandise globally. Whether these business considerations constitute an argument for the show's continued creative vitality is a separate question. MacFarlane himself, when asked about the show's future in a 2024 interview, described it in terms of what he called escape velocity, the idea that a show, which has run as long as Family Guy has generates its own momentum, that there is no longer a logical reason to end it unless the audience disappears entirely, and the audience has not disappeared. He spoke about the show generating revenue for environmental causes he cares about, particularly through his support of organizations like the Rainforest Trust. He did not speak about burning creative ambitions for the show, about stories he was desperate to tell, about directions the characters could go that excited him. This is honest. It is perhaps the most honest thing a creator can say about a show they have been making for more than 25 years. That it continues because it can, because the audience wants it to, because it funds things that matter, and because there is no compelling reason to end it. These are not the words of someone at the beginning of a creative journey. They are the words of someone at a different stage, one where the relationship with the work is about sustaining what was built rather than building something new. The show that exists today aired on Wednesday nights, watched by a smaller but still loyal audience, still producing episodes that occasionally find genuine comedy alongside ones that coast on the memory of when the comedy was easier, is both the same show and a different show from what premiered on January 31, 1999. The characters have the same names and the same physical forms. The setting is the same. Seth MacFarlane's voice is still Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire. But the animating vision that drove those first seasons, the specific creative energy of a 25-year-old with something to prove, working from a thesis film he had made in college, drawing on everything he had absorbed since he was 2 years old, that energy is not and cannot be what it was. This is not a tragedy. It is simply the normal trajectory of a long creative life in a commercial medium. It is what happens when something private and personal becomes public and institutional. The best of it endures in the early seasons, where it was made. And those seasons are still there, available to watch, still funny, still surprising in ways that the later seasons are not. Section 12. The real reason Family Guy was created. We have spent considerable time in this script tracing the origins of Family Guy, the small Connecticut town, the art school in Providence, the borrowed office shared with the King of the Hill writers, the 6 months alone in a Los Angeles kitchen, the $50,000 pilot budget, the Super Bowl slot, the 2 cancellations, the Adult Swim resurrection, the DVD revolution. All of this is factual. All of this is part of the story. But the question the title of this video promises to address is a different one from the simple biographical narrative. The question is not how Family Guy came to exist. The question is why. Not in the commercial sense, why did Fox want to make it? Or why did it make financial sense? In the personal sense, why did Seth MacFarlane need to make this particular thing? What was it for? What was he trying to do that he could not have done in any other form? The answer requires going back to Kent, Connecticut, to the child who was drawing at 2 and published a comic strip at 9 and made a thesis film in college that was really a pitch, that was really a plan, that was really the first step in building the thing he had been heading toward since he was old enough to ask how cartoons were made. MacFarlane has talked, across many years of interviews, about what family means. Not in the abstract, in the specific, messy, exhausting, irreplaceable specific sense of the families that most people actually live in. The family that is held together not by any external force but by the shared history of having been in the same rooms for years, of knowing each other's worst qualities and staying anyway, of the particular combination of obligation and genuine love that makes a family something different from any other kind of human group. His own family was, by external measures, functional. His parents were educated, stable, community-involved people. His sister Rachel would become a voice actress, which suggests a household where creativity was encouraged rather than viewed with suspicion. His father was a teacher. His mother worked in admissions. They gave him an 8mm camera. They found him a book about flip books when he was 5. But every family, however functional, contains private textures that the exterior does not show. The particular quality of a father-child relationship. The specific way a sibling rivalry expresses itself. The thing that is never said at dinner. The love that is real but not always graceful. MacFarlane has been quieter about these private textures than about the professional biography. What he has been explicit about is the desire to make something that was about family in the way that he understood family, not as a site of simple warmth, not as a postcard image of domestic harmony, but as the place where the most important things happen to people, and where those things are frequently terrible and frequently funny, and always, underneath all the terrible funny things, charged with the electricity of people who matter to each other. The Griffin family in those first 3 seasons is a family in this sense. Peter matters to Lois, Lois matters to Peter. The children matter to both of them in the way that children matter to parents, not because the parents are always good at expressing it, but because the mattering is so fundamental that even bad expression of it does not make it less real. Stewie is trying to kill his mother, but he is also, in the earliest episodes, sometimes simply Lois's baby. He falls asleep against her shoulder. He is comforted by her presence even as he plots her destruction. That particular combination, the murderous ambition and the infant need, is not just absurdist comedy. It is something true about children and parents. Children love and resent the people they need. The love and the resentment coexist without canceling each other out. MacFarlane was also making a show that was genuinely about American working-class life, which is a subject that has been addressed with varying degrees of honesty across the history of American television. All in the Family did it in the 1970s, with a commitment to the ugliness and the dignity of that life simultaneously. Roseanne, in the late 1980s and 1990s, did it with a particular ferocity about economic precarity. The Simpsons did it with warmth and intelligence across its first several seasons. MacFarlane added to this tradition something of his own, a quality of New England working-class humor that had a different texture from Midwestern working-class humor, All in the Family, set in Queens, notwithstanding a specific relationship to neighborhood and bar and church that reflected where he had grown up and what he had absorbed there. The show was also, in ways that took time to become fully visible, a vehicle for MacFarlane's own anxieties about intelligence and creativity and what it means to want to make things that matter. Brian Griffin is the most direct expression of this. Brian wants to be a serious writer. He is working on a novel that he cannot finish. He drinks too much. He falls in love with women who do not love him back. He has ideas that he believes are important and finds himself unable to communicate them with the precision he intends. He is surrounded by people who are, in various ways, less capable than he is, but are also, in various ways, happier. This is a recognizable anxiety, the anxiety of the person who has committed to something difficult and creative, and who fears that the commitment will not be sufficient, that the talent will not be sufficient, that the love of the thing will not produce the thing. MacFarlane gave this anxiety to Brian and made it funny, which is one of the things you can do with an anxiety you cannot resolve. If you cannot stop feeling it, you can at least make it entertaining. The cutaway gag itself, the form that would become Family Guy's most distinctive feature, is a kind of anxiety made structural. The cutaway says, "The story we are telling is connected to everything else, to the whole accumulation of cultural reference and human experience, and at any moment a thread from that vast connected web can be pulled into the present and examined, briefly, before the story continues. This is how memory actually works. This is how the mind actually works. You are doing one thing, and you suddenly remember another thing, and the connection between them is real, even if it is not logical, and the remembering is part of the experience of the doing." Family Guy was made, in the deepest sense, to do something that only animation can fully do, to be simultaneously realistic and fantastical, to put genuine human emotion inside bodies that cannot be hurt in the ways real bodies can be hurt, to explore the things families do to each other through a medium that can absorb those things and make them visible without being destroyed by them. MacFarlane's grandfather Arthur Sager competed in the 1928 Summer Olympics in track and field. MacFarlane himself descends from Mayflower passengers, from people who crossed an ocean in a small wooden boat to build something they had never seen and that they were not certain could be built. The McFarlane disposition, going back through generations, seems to be toward doing things that require sustained commitment to an uncertain outcome, with the specific and unwavering belief that arrival is possible. Seth MacFarlane arrived. He made Family Guy, which is one of the longest-running animated series in the history of American television. He made American Dad, which arguably surpassed its predecessor in sustained creative quality. He made The Orville. He has released 9 studio albums. He has hosted the Oscars. He produced Cosmos. He nearly boarded American Airlines Flight 1 on the morning of the 11th of September 2001, and did not because a travel agent wrote down the wrong departure time, and he had gone out the night before with some faculty members from his old college and had a few drinks, and arrived at Logan Airport in Boston approximately 10 minutes too late to board. He sat in the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up 45 minutes later to commotion. The first plane had hit the North Tower. He sat there and watched the second plane hit. And then they announced which flight had crashed first. And he turned to the person next to him and said that he knew that flight. That was the flight he was supposed to be on. He had missed it by 10 minutes. He sent his travel agent a basket of booze. He described the experience years later as sobering but not, for him, life-altering in the way that near-death experiences are often described as being. He said he was not a fatalist. He said, "These things happen." He said there are probably 100 close calls for everyone every year, and most of them are so small we never notice. But this one was not small, and we notice it, because the person who did not board that flight went on to make a show that has been watched by hundreds of millions of people. The person who was not on American Airlines Flight 1 is also the person who was drawing Fred Flintstone at 2 years old in Kent, Connecticut, the person who published a comic strip at 9, the person who made the life of Larry in his senior year of college because he could not make it, because it had been building in him for as long as he could remember. And the thesis film was simply the first moment it could come out of him and be something other people could see. Family Guy was created because Seth MacFarlane needed to make it the way some people need to make the things they make, not as a commercial calculation, not as a career strategy, but as the thing that was waiting inside him to be made. The specific combination of everything he had absorbed and everyone he had loved and every anxiety he had carried and every laugh he had chased and every memory of New England winter and Rhode Island coast and Cartoon Network Saturday morning and Sinatra and Monty Python and All in the Family and one particular security guard's voice on a college campus that had settled into his imagination and never left. That is the real reason Family Guy was created. Not because Fox had a gap in the Sunday night lineup, not because the adult animation demographic was underserved, not because DVDs were about to change the economics of television. All of those things are true and all of them matter. But the real reason is simpler and older and more human than any of them. A boy in Connecticut wanted to make cartoons. He wanted to make them the way his specific brain and his specific life and his specific sensitivity to what was funny and what was sad and what was both simultaneously at the same time had equipped him to make them. He drew at 2 and published at 9 and animated in college and drove to Los Angeles and worked in borrowed offices and hand-drew 15 minutes of television in his kitchen over 6 months and did not sleep enough and cared about it with a specificity that is still, after everything, visible in the best episodes of the show he made. The Griffin family exists because a person needed them to exist, because he had things to say about family and about America and about the specific comedy of people who love each other doing terrible things to each other, and this was the form those things took when they came out of him. Everything else, the cancellations, the revivals, the DVD sales, the Adult Swim ratings, the Emmy nominations, the ratings collapse, the Wednesday night schedule, the 2025 renewal through season 27, all of it is aftermath. The reason Family Guy was created is in a small town in Connecticut, in the sound of a security guard's voice on a college campus, in a 6-month stretch alone in a kitchen in Los Angeles, in the thesis film that a professor submitted to Hanna-Barbera without asking permission first. It was created because Seth MacFarlane could not have done anything else. And that, more than anything, is why the best of it is still, after all these years, genuinely great. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I hope it found you somewhere comfortable and helped the night feel a little slower. Drop a like if this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, and if you haven't subscribed yet, The button is right there. It genuinely makes a difference to how we build these videos. Until next time, wherever you are, rest well. End of script. Word count target: 30,000 plus words. Actual estimated word count: approximately 31,500 words across 12 sections. Section 13. The voice actor behind 4 characters. One of the most unusual aspects of Family Guy from a production standpoint is the sheer volume of creative labor concentrated in a single performer. Seth MacFarlane does not simply create the show and oversee it from a distance. He voices Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire, 4 of the 6 main characters, plus a rotating cast of recurring and guest roles that adds up, over the course of 20-plus seasons, to an extraordinary number of distinct voice performances delivered by one human being. To understand what this means in practice, you have to think about what voice acting actually requires. It is not simply doing an impression, though impression ability is part of it. It is the sustained embodiment of a character's emotional state, the ability to find the correct delivery for a line across an enormous range of emotional contexts, and to maintain perfect consistency so that Peter Griffin in Season 20 sounds like Peter Griffin in Season 1, not because the character hasn't changed, but because the voice is the anchor of identity that tells the audience they are watching the same person. MacFarlane has been the vocal anchor of Family Guy for the entirety of its run. He was in the recording booth for every episode. He delivered every line that Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire have ever spoken across hundreds of episodes and more than 2 decades. The physical and creative stamina this requires is considerable. Each voice represents a distinct technical challenge. Peter's voice requires a specific placement in the chest and throat, that Rhode Island broadness, the slightly constricted vowels, the way confidence outpaces intelligence in the delivery. It is a character voice that has to sound effortless but cannot be delivered effortlessly. If you listen to MacFarlane in interviews speaking in his own voice, you can hear how complete the transformation is into Peter. They do not sound remotely similar. Brian uses MacFarlane's actual speaking voice, but this is not as simple as it sounds. His speaking voice in a recording booth doing Brian is not the same as his speaking voice in an interview. The character delivery, the specific timing, the way Brian's dry humor lands in the rhythm of a line, the slight weariness that gives the character its texture has to be produced with the same consistency across every recording session, in the same way that a musician plays their instrument with the same touch across every performance, even when the pieces are different. Stewie's voice is the most theatrical, the most technically demanding in the conventional sense of voice acting. Rex Harrison's Professor Higgins is a very specific sonic reference point: that upper received pronunciation, English accent, the precision of the consonants, the controlled placement of each vowel, the way the character's intelligence expresses itself in the rhythm of his speech rather than simply in the content of what he says. MacFarlane reaches this register and holds it, episode after episode, for a character who delivers some of the longest and most elaborate speeches in the show. What is particularly striking about watching MacFarlane in discussions of his voice work is how genuinely he seems to inhabit these characters rather than produce them at a technical distance. He has spoken about knowing immediately what voice he wanted for each character and feeling that he was the person to provide it, not out of ego, but out of the practical conviction that he could transmit the character more precisely by performing it himself than by describing it to someone else. The decision to voice 4 main characters also has implications for the show's creative process. MacFarlane was present in the recording studio for every session. This meant that even as his writing involvement decreased after 2010, he remained the auditory center of the show. The voices he provided were the show's most recognizable element, the thing that anyone who had ever heard a clip immediately associated with Family Guy. In some sense, his physical presence in the recording booth kept him connected to the show even after his creative role had become primarily executive. He also provided numerous supporting and recurring voices: news anchor Tom Tucker, Carter Pewterschmidt, Dr. Hartman, and many one-time characters. The ability to produce a wide range of voices to be genuinely protean in that way is a rare skill. Most voice actors who can do one excellent character voice cannot do 5 excellent and distinct ones. MacFarlane has always been unusual in this specific capacity, which he demonstrated in The Life of Larry, where he voiced essentially all the characters himself, and which he has continued to demonstrate across his entire career. His sister Rachel MacFarlane voices Haley on American Dad, which means that two of the primary voices on a show Seth MacFarlane co-created are MacFarlane voices, in the literal familial sense. This detail is charming in a way that says something about the MacFarlane creative household, the tendency to put the people you know and trust into the things you make, to bring your actual life into the fictional one, to allow the professional and the personal to inform each other. Section 14, the Super Bowl, and what the perfect premiere means. Very few television moments compare, in terms of sheer concentrated viewership, to the hour of television that follows the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl itself is the most watched broadcast in American television every year without exception. The game's audience is not merely large, it is cross-demographic in a way that almost nothing else on broadcast television achieves in the modern era. People who watch almost no television watch the Super Bowl. People who primarily stream their entertainment make an exception for the Super Bowl. The audience is genuinely massive, in a way that bears almost no relationship to the audiences of ordinary primetime programming. What follows the Super Bowl is therefore among the most valuable programming real estate in all of American television. The network that broadcasts the game gets to put something directly after it in front of an audience of 60, 70, sometimes 80 million people. What they choose to put there is both a statement of intent and an enormous opportunity. Fox chose to put Family Guy directly after Super Bowl 33 on the 31st of January 1999. The game itself was Denver versus Atlanta, and Denver won handily 34-19, which is not quite the kind of tightly contested game that keeps audiences transfixed to the final whistle, but the audience was enormous regardless. When the game ended and the halftime recap had been absorbed, and John Elway had received his trophy and all the post-game ceremonies were complete, tens of millions of people were still sitting in front of their televisions. And then Death Has a Shadow started. For many viewers, this was their absolute first encounter with Family Guy. They had not seen a promotional campaign for it. They may have had no idea who Seth MacFarlane was. They may not have known that Fox had a new animated show at all. They were simply people who had watched a football game and had not yet decided to turn off the television. 22 million of them stayed to watch. That number, 22 million viewers for the first episode of Family Guy, is the largest audience the show has ever had, and it has never been approached in the decades since. It is a number that reflects the artificial amplification of the Super Bowl lead-in rather than the organic audience the show would build over time, and MacFarlane himself has acknowledged this with characteristic dryness, noting that the difference between The Life of Larry and Family Guy was that one was shown primarily in his dorm room and the other was shown after the Super Bowl, but the opportunity was seized rather than squandered. Death Has a Shadow is a solid pilot episode. It is not the best episode the show would ever produce. Pilots rarely are, because pilots are serving too many functions simultaneously, introducing characters and setting and tone and comedy style and emotional register all at once, which leaves less room for the specific creative excellence that emerges when a show has established its foundation and can build on it. But it was a good pilot. It was funny. It was inventive. It introduced every character in a way that made you want to spend more time with them. The Super Bowl premiere established Family Guy in the national conversation in a way that a standard mid-season debut would not have. People talked about the show at work on Monday mornings. Critics who had seen advance copies had already written about it. The cultural conversation had a starting point that was dramatic enough to generate momentum. What is also worth noting is the specific timing of Family Guy's premiere in the broader context of animated television. The Simpsons had been on the air for a decade. South Park had premiered in 1997 and was already controversial and successful. King of the Hill, which shared the Sunday night Fox lineup with Family Guy, had been running since 1997. The adult animation landscape in January 1999 was therefore already somewhat established. This was not an entirely new form that Family Guy was introducing, but rather a new entrant into a form that had proven itself. MacFarlane had watched this landscape develop and had been deliberate about what he wanted Family Guy to contribute to it. He did not want to make another Simpsons. He did not want to make South Park, which operated on different principles of controversy and shock. He wanted to make something that was his own synthesis of everything he had absorbed, a show that could exist comfortably alongside The Simpsons and King of the Hill while being distinct from both of them. The Super Bowl premiere announced that Family Guy was here and that it was going to be different. The 22 million viewers who watched Death Has a Shadow were the widest possible early audience the show could have had, and while many of them did not become regular viewers, the show dropped significantly from that artificial peak. Enough of them did to establish a foundation for what would become, eventually, one of the most culturally significant animated series in television history. Section 15: What Kent, Connecticut made. It is tempting, when tracing the origins of a creative work, to focus primarily on the formal influences and professional experiences that shaped it. The shows a creator watched, the schools they attended, the industry jobs that trained them, the pitches and meetings and contracts that led to the moment of creation. These things are real and they matter, but they do not fully account for the quality that separates work that is competent from work that has something in it. The thing that distinguishes the best of Family Guy from animation that is merely technically accomplished is a quality that comes from somewhere more private than the list of influences. It comes from the place the creator actually comes from, the particular community, with its particular humor and its particular understanding of what it means to live in the world as the kind of people who live there. Seth MacFarlane comes from Kent, Connecticut, and from Rhode Island, in the way that people who grow up in a place and then leave it carry that place with them permanently. The leaving does not erase it. It sometimes intensifies it. The distance makes the specificity more visible, because you can see it against the contrast of what is different. New England has a particular culture of humor. It tends toward understatement. It values concision. It reserves genuine warmth and expresses it obliquely. The joke is often delivered as though it is not a joke, and the laughter comes from recognizing, after a pause, that it was. The emotional sincerity, when it appears, is often surrounded by comedy on both sides, as though sincerity requires the permission of humor before it can enter a room. This is the cultural atmosphere that MacFarlane absorbed in Kent. His father was a teacher. His mother worked in school administration. His town was the kind of place where the headmaster of the local prep school would launch a public campaign against a former student's television show because the show offended his sense of propriety, and this actually happened when the Kent school's father Richardson Shell urged advertisers to boycott Family Guy in mid-1999, citing the show's offensive content. MacFarlane had attended the Kent school. Father Shell had been his headmaster. The boycott campaign faded largely because the media linked Shell's anger to the coincidence that the fictional family name, Griffin, was also the name of the Kent school's longtime secretary, though MacFarlane insisted this connection was accidental. The story is small and slightly comic, but it is also revealing. The people who governed the institution MacFarlane had come from were deeply uncomfortable with what he was making, and the discomfort expressed itself in the particular way of a certain kind of New England institutional authority through proper channels, through the language of advertiser responsibility and community standards, through appeals to the network of power that surrounds a prep school. MacFarlane was 25 years old, and his former headmaster was writing letters to advertisers about him. This is the atmosphere he had carried away from Kent. An atmosphere that took community standards seriously, that had clear expectations about what was and was not appropriate to say, and that he had been quietly subverting since he was 9 years old, and asked if he could have fries with his communion wafer. The Rhode Island setting of Family Guy is not arbitrary. MacFarlane chose to set the show in Rhode Island because he had lived there, because he knew it, because the specific quality of Rhode Island working-class life, close-knit, slightly provincial, funny about itself, deeply attached to neighborhood and bar and sports teams, and the particular Catholic-inflected culture of the New England mill towns was material he could use from the inside. He was not guessing at what it felt like to live in Cranston or Providence. He had been a student there. He had walked those streets. He had eaten in those diners. The show's setting is therefore never quite generic, even when the comedy is broad. The fictional city of Quahog sits in a real geography of feeling, a real texture of life that the show draws on even when it is doing something completely absurd. This is what makes the absurdity land. There is a grounded reality underneath it that the audience can feel, even if they cannot name it, even if they have never been to Rhode Island. The specific quality of Peter Griffin's friendship with his bar companions, the way they occupy the drunken clam with a kind of territorial ease, the way their conversations are simultaneously about nothing and deeply meaningful, the specific way Peter and Cleveland and Joe and Quagmire relate to each other as people who have been in proximity long enough that their relationships have the texture of actual history. This comes from an understanding of how men in New England working class communities actually relate to each other. It is not observed from outside, it was absorbed from inside. McFarlane's musical taste, the Sinatra, the Dean Martin, the big band arrangements he would eventually record himself, is also, in its way, New England in origin. The specific generational memory that runs through certain communities in that region. The Italian-American and Irish-American families whose cultural touchstones were the entertainment world of the 1950s left traces in the broader culture that Seth encountered growing up. The music of his parents' generation and his grandparents' generation was genuinely present in his environment. He absorbed it without trying to. All of this went into Family Guy in ways that cannot be extracted and cataloged, but that can be felt when you watch the show at its best. It has a rootedness. It believes in its own world. The people in it are not just vehicles for jokes, they are, or were intended to be, people with histories and communities and a specific sense of where they belonged in the world. The boy from Kent, Connecticut, sitting in front of a television watching cartoons at 2 years old, drawing Fred Flintstone with the serious concentration of someone who has recognized their purpose, became the man who built a world out of everything he had absorbed in that New England childhood and carried it into a Los Angeles apartment and drew it by hand into a 15-minute pitch that changed the shape of prime time television. He could not have made it from anywhere else. The show is, at its irreducible core, a product of where he came from and who those origins made him. The comedy is particular. The emotion is particular. The mixture of warmth and absurdity and cultural satire and working-class specificity is particular. It could only have been made by someone for whom all of those things were not elements to be assembled, but aspects of a single, coherent reality they had grown up inside. Section 16. The specific texture of early Griffin family dynamics. When people who love the early seasons of Family Guy try to articulate what they love about them, they often reach for phrases like, "it felt real," or "the characters actually cared about each other," or "there was something underneath the jokes." These are attempts to describe a specific quality that is genuinely difficult to capture analytically, but that is immediately recognizable in the episodes themselves. The quality is the texture of the Griffin family as a unit. Not as individual characters, though the individual characters are all well constructed, but as the specific social organism that forms when these particular people live together and have to navigate each other's existence on a daily basis. Every family develops its own interior language, its own set of unspoken agreements about what is allowed and what is not, its own patterns of conflict and resolution that repeat so reliably they become part of the family's identity. The best writing about families manages to suggest this without explaining it, to make the audience feel the family's history through the texture of its present interactions rather than through exposition about what happened before the story began. The early Family Guy episodes do this consistently. Peter and Lois have an argument dynamic that is entirely theirs. The specific way she tries to redirect him when he is heading toward disaster, the specific way he resists that redirection and then suffers the consequences, the specific way the episode comes back around to them, in the same room, with something healed between them that had been broken. It is not a generic married couple dynamic. It is Peter and Lois, and the specificity of it is what makes it feel real. Meg's place in the family, in those first 3 seasons, is the specific place of the middle child who is not remarkable in any of the ways her family is remarkable. She does not have Peter's capacity for disaster-generating stupidity, which at least makes Peter interesting. She does not have Lois's patience and competence. She does not have Chris's cheerful cluelessness. She does not have Stewie's terrifying genius. She does not have Brian's wit and self-awareness. She is simply Meg, the normal one, the one who wants to be liked at school, the one who has a crush on a boy, the one who feels overlooked in a household where nothing is ever ordinary except her. In the first 3 seasons, this is played with genuine sympathy. Meg is not a target. She is a character. Her need to be seen and accepted is treated as legitimate, as something the audience is invited to feel alongside her rather than laugh at from a safe distance. She is, in the peculiar logic of the show, the most human character in a family of extreme types, and the show in those seasons treats this as a source of gentle, knowing comedy rather than as an invitation to cruelty. The relationship between Peter and Brian is the emotional engine of the first seasons in a way that is easy to underestimate. Brian is Peter's best friend. Not in the way that Joe and Cleveland are Peter's friends. Those friendships are about proximity and shared activities, about the bar as meeting place and neighborhood as context. The Peter-Brian friendship is something different. It is the friendship of two people who are in some fundamental sense each other's most important audience. Brian for Peter's disasters, Peter for Brian's aspirations. Brian watches Peter with the amused exasperation of someone who knows the person in front of them is about to do something terrible and loves them enough to stay anyway. Peter watches Brian with the generous incomprehension of someone who does not fully understand what Brian is trying to do but believes in Brian's right to do it. This dynamic creates the emotional texture that the show needed to carry its comedy. Without the genuine warmth between Peter and Brian, the show's humor would be colder, more purely satirical, harder to stay in. The warmth gives you permission to laugh at Peter's disasters because Brian is laughing too, and Brian's laughter is the laughter of someone who cares what happens to the man in front of them. If Brian found Peter simply pathetic, the audience would find him pathetic too, and pathetic is not funny the same way that lovably catastrophic is funny. Stewie's relationship with Lois in the early seasons is a masterwork of sustained dramatic irony. Lois has no idea. She picks up her baby, feeds him, changes him, rocks him to sleep, and has absolutely no knowledge of the weapons under the mattress and the detailed plans for her assassination in the notebook she mistook for a finger-painting journal. Stewie, for his part, is conducting his murderous campaigns against someone who loves him with the uncomplicated ferocity of mothers, who do not need their love returned intelligently to go on loving. The comedy of this dynamic goes somewhere unexpected when you look at it closely. The joke is that Stewie wants to kill Lois, yes, but the actual texture of their relationship is one of complete intimacy. She knows his body's rhythms, his feeding schedule, the specific sound of his breathing when he is trying not to sleep. He knows the exact quality of her presence in a room. They are as close as a mother and infant can be. The murderous ambition floats above this intimacy without disturbing it. He will go right back to plotting her destruction after she has put him down for his nap, and the nap will still soothe him the way a mother's care always does. This is the show at its most quietly sophisticated, finding the genuine truth inside the absurdity, the real thing inside the joke. Stewie is a baby. Stewie loves his mother. Stewie would, if his schemes worked, kill his mother. All three of these things are simultaneously true, and the comedy comes from their coexistence rather than from any one of them alone. MacFarlane knew this in the first seasons. He was constructing, in a cartoon format, something that had the emotional logic of good fiction, the kind of fiction where what the characters want and what they feel and what they do are all in complicated relationship with each other, where no one thing is simple, where the comedy is funny partly because it is also true. Section 17, the cutaway gag is innovation. The cutaway gag is so thoroughly associated with Family Guy that it is easy to forget that it was an innovation when the show introduced it to primetime animated television. It is also easy to misunderstand what it originally was, because the later evolution of the cutaway into a dominant structural element obscures the more modest role it played in the show's first seasons. A cutaway gag in its basic form is simple. A character says something, usually a comparison or a reference, and the show cuts to a brief visual illustration of that thing before returning to the main story. This is worse than the time I, followed by a cut to whatever that time was. The structure is immediately legible. The audience adapts to it almost instantly, because the logic is the logic of human memory and association, the way the mind moves sideways when a comparison presents itself. In the early seasons, the cutaways were short, specific, and precise. They lasted between 5 and 15 seconds in most cases. They made one joke and got out. They did not try to do more than they could do in their brief appearance, and they did not overstay their welcome. They were, as MacFarlane intended them, seasoning rather than main course, something that added flavor to what was already a satisfying narrative meal. The innovation was not the concept of the cutaway itself, which existed in various forms in sketch comedy and in certain styles of stand-up comedy that involve frequent tangential excursions. The innovation was the application of the concept to an animated sitcom format in prime time, with the specific rhythm and brevity that MacFarlane deployed in those first seasons. The cutaways were engineered to feel effortless, to be in and out before the audience had time to consciously register the interruption to the main story. They also served a function that went beyond pure comedy. The cutaways established a tone for the show, an aesthetic position about the relationship between narrative and digression. The show's position was that the digression was as valuable as the narrative, that the sideways move was not a failure of focus but an acknowledgement that human experience is not linear, that memory and imagination and reference are constantly interrupting the story we think we are telling. The cutaway structure was, in this sense, a formal expression of something true about consciousness. The most celebrated cutaway gags in the show's run, the ones that circulate most widely on the internet, the ones that people quote years after having seen them, tend to be ones from the early and middle seasons, when the cutaways were still being used with the precision of instruments rather than the frequency of habit. The ones where the connection between the setup and the cutaway is surprising but, in retrospect, inevitable. The ones where the gag illuminates something about the character making the comparison as much as it illustrates the comparison itself. When Peter compares his current situation to something that happened to him, the specific nature of the thing that happened to him is a character detail. The experiences stored in Peter's memory, the ones that come forward as comparisons when he needs a reference point, reveal something about his inner life, his cultural vocabulary, his range of experience, his particular way of understanding the world. The best cutaways are not merely funny illustrations. They are character moments that happen to be funny. This is the sophistication that would eventually be lost when the cutaways became the dominant structural element of the show, rather than one element among several. When a cutaway must justify its own existence as entertainment, rather than serving a story that exists around it, it loses the connection to character that made the best of them memorable. It becomes a sketch, isolated, evaluated on its own terms rather than in relationship to the world that produced it. But in the first seasons, the cutaway gag was a genuine formal innovation that made Family Guy distinctive in a way that other animated shows were not, and that gave it a comedy rhythm that has been imitated many times since without quite being replicated, because the imitators have often taken the form without the underlying discipline. The form required discipline. It required knowing when to cut away and when not to, when a comparison called for visual illustration and when it was better left to the imagination, when the gag deserved 15 seconds and when it deserved 5. MacFarlane had this discipline in the early seasons. It was part of what his years at Hanna-Barbera and RISD had built, the instinct for economy, for knowing when something had done enough and it was time to move on. The precision of those early cutaways is visible in retrospect as a kind of craftsmanship. The show was being made carefully, with attention to what worked and what didn't, with a willingness to leave something on the floor rather than include it simply because it existed. That willingness to cut to reduce, to eliminate, to arrive at the minimum necessary version of a joke is one of the hardest disciplines in comedy, and it is one of the first things that erodes when a show becomes successful enough that its instincts are no longer being tested by the demands of proving themselves. In those first 3 seasons, Family Guy was still proving itself. The cutaway gag was an instrument in that proof. Section 18. What Death Has a Shadow tells us about the show's soul. The first episode of any long-running show is a document of intent. It cannot always fulfill its own intentions. Pilots are frequently clumsy compared to the show they eventually become, too busy with the work of establishment to demonstrate their full potential, but they tell you something foundational about what the creators believe the show is. Death Has a Shadow, the first episode of Family Guy, tells you several important things about what Seth MacFarlane believed his show was going to be. The premise is relatively grounded. Peter loses his job at the happy-go-lucky toy factory because he drinks too much at a work party and falls asleep while operating machinery. He doesn't tell Lois. He applies for welfare to cover the household income he's no longer providing. He receives an enormous amount of money, far more than he was entitled to, and spends it on frivolous things, including hiring a professional football team to play in the backyard, before eventually doing something characteristically catastrophic to try to dispose of the excess, dropping it from a blimp over the Super Bowl. He is arrested. The family has to come rescue him. What this premise establishes is a specific kind of comedy engine. Peter causes a problem. The problem escalates beyond what Peter intended or anticipated. The escalation reaches a point of genuine consequence. The family responds. Resolution comes, but not without cost. This is not the structure of a show that is simply putting a character through random disasters for the sake of generating jokes. It is the structure of a domestic comedy that takes consequence seriously, that believes actions have outcomes, that the outcome of a bad decision matters, that the audience should care what happens to the characters because the characters are affecting each other. The episode also, immediately, establishes the emotional register that would define the best of the show's early run. When Peter is arrested, the family, Lois and the kids and Brian, come to his bail hearing. They are frustrated with him. They are also there. The love and the exasperation are present simultaneously, which is the emotional texture of actual families rather than the simplified version of families that lesser domestic comedies tend to present. Lois's speech at the bail hearing is, in retrospect, one of the small indicators of what the show was trying to do. She is furious. She is also defending her husband. She is asserting the family's position while privately processing the betrayal of his deception. In a half-hour animated comedy that premiered after the Super Bowl, to an audience of 22 million people who probably expected broadly physical humor and rapid-fire jokes, this moment of genuine emotional complexity is a small declaration of intent. The show knows what it is doing with its characters. It is not treating them as mechanisms. Peter's realization, by the end of the episode, that he has caused harm, that his actions have had consequences for the people he loves, is also a specific character moment. He does not arrive at this understanding gracefully or eloquently. He arrives at it in the way that Peter arrives at most understandings, somewhat accidentally, through the experience of seeing the consequences rather than reasoning toward them. But he does arrive at it. The early Peter was a character who could learn. He learned slowly, imprecisely, and sometimes temporarily. But he learned. The episode also establishes the show's relationship with American culture and with the specific cultural moment of the late 1990s. The Super Bowl appears as both setting and backdrop. The welfare system is a plot device that carries with it, without heavy-handedness, a set of implicit observations about American assumptions around poverty and government assistance and who deserves what. The way the system malfunctions in Peter's favor, generating far more money than he should have received, is a particular kind of satirical observation, suggesting that the systems humans build tend to malfunction in ways that reward the wrong people. This is not a politically pointed show in the way that All in the Family was politically pointed. Family Guy's political observations are lateral, embedded, delivered in passing rather than foregrounded. But they are present in the first episode, suggesting that from the beginning, MacFarlane wanted the show to be engaging with something beyond the immediate comedy. The cutaways in Death Has a Shadow are brief and disciplined, exactly the kind of quick, lateral jumps that the early show used them for, in and out before the main story loses its thread. The episode knows when to use them and when not to, which is information that the creators learned and then, over time, lost. The voice performances in the pilot are also worth noting. MacFarlane's Peter sounds slightly different from later seasons. The voice is finding its register, not quite as settled into its groove as it would become. But Brian is immediately and fully present, the dryness and the wit completely established from the first line. Stewie speaks with the refined menace of someone who has thought carefully about every word and found them all adequate to his intelligence. The Stewie of the first episode is the Stewie that fans spent 20-plus seasons missing after the character softened precisely, elegantly malevolent, operating at a frequency slightly removed from everything around him. Alex Borstein's Lois in that first episode is warm and grounded in the way that Lois would be for the first several seasons before her character was somewhat flattened. The voice she created for the character, that great neck accent, the slightly ironic warmth of it, establishes Lois as a specific person with a specific history rather than a generic sitcom wife. You immediately believe that she and Peter have been together long enough that she knows exactly how to respond to each of his disasters. All of this is visible in the first episode, in miniature form, as intention and promise. The show Family Guy would become in its best seasons was fully sketched in Death Has a Shadow. The characters were there. The emotional logic was there. The comedy structure was there. What the show needed, and what the next 2 seasons provided was the space to develop and deepen what the pilot had outlined. What it would spend subsequent years gradually losing was the discipline of the pilot, the restraint, the attention to consequence, the willingness to let the characters feel things and the audience care about what they felt. But the fact that all of it was there in the beginning, fully articulated in a pilot episode that aired after a football game to 22 million people who had never heard of Seth MacFarlane. That tells you something important about how completely MacFarlane had visualized what he was building before he built it. He knew what the show was from the first episode. The question of whether the show could sustain being that thing is a different question, and one that the history of Family Guy answers in complicated ways. Section 19. The meaning of the near miss. On the 10th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane gave a speech at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, in Providence. He went out afterward with some faculty members. He had drinks. He stayed later than he had planned. He woke the next morning for a flight from Boston to Los Angeles. He was supposed to be on American Airlines Flight 11, departing at 7:45 a.m. from Logan International Airport en route to Los Angeles International. His travel agent had listed the departure time incorrectly on his itinerary. She had written 8:15 a.m. He arrived at Logan at approximately 7:50 a.m. or thereabouts, 10 minutes or so after the gate had closed for a flight that was scheduled to leave in less than an hour. He was told he was too late. He took the next available flight. He went into the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up 45 minutes later to commotion. Screens everywhere were showing the same image. He watched the second plane hit the South Tower. Someone announced which flight had struck first. He turned to the person sitting next to him and said that he knew that flight. He had been booked on it. There is a way to read this moment, the near miss of the 11th of September 2001, as a dramatic punctuation mark in MacFarlane's life story, the moment that separates everything before it from everything after it, the hinge on which the entire subsequent career rotates. The man who nearly died and then lived to make a great deal more television. MacFarlane himself has specifically resisted this reading. He has said repeatedly, across many interviews and many years, that the experience did not profoundly change him, did not make him a fatalist, did not reorganize his relationship to his work or his life. He has said that close calls happen all the time, at the scale of the nearly hit by a car and the nearly stumbled at the top of the stairs, and that most of them are invisible to us because we are unaware they were close calls. This one was visible because of what happened to the flight he had not been on. He sent his travel agent a basket of alcohol as a thank you for making the error that saved his life. He described the bartender in the airport lounge pouring him a shot when he mentioned which flight he'd been booked on. He told Howard Stern that when he got to the counter and was told he was too late, he simply said, "All right, I'll take the 11 o'clock," and went to sit down. The composure in that account is remarkable, whether it reflects the actual emotional experience of the moment or the perspective that years of distance have provided. The man who was 10 minutes late for the flight that would have killed him, who sat down in an airport lounge and fell asleep while waiting for the next one, who woke up to discover what had happened to the plane he had not been on, this man, by his own description, approached the experience the way a rational person approaches all the things that nearly happen and then don't. What the September 11 near miss does tell us, without requiring any dramatic interpretation of it as a turning point, is something about the contingency underlying the entire story we have been telling in this script. Family Guy, American Dad, The Orville, Ted, Cosmos, all of it is contingent, in ways that are slightly vertiginous to contemplate, on a travel agent's error and a night of drinks with faculty members and a tendency, by MacFarlane's own account, to generally be late for flights. The Life of Larry, which was submitted to Hanna-Barbera by a professor without asking MacFarlane's permission, is also contingent in this way. The professor might not have submitted it. Ellen Cockrell might not have been in the audience at the senior screening. King of the Hill might not have been a success, which would have meant Fox's renewed interest in animated programming might have come later, which would have meant the second pitch to Fox might not have found the reception it did. All of it is built on a series of moments where things went one way rather than another, where a decision was made or a person was present or an error was committed that redirected the flow of subsequent events. This is not unusual. Every life and every career is built this way. But it is worth sitting with quietly, the understanding that the 22 million people who watched Death Has a Shadow after Super Bowl 33, and the hundreds of millions who have watched Family Guy in the years since encountered the show because of a sequence of contingencies that included a RISD professor's decision and a travel agent's mistake. The boy from Kent, Connecticut, who started drawing at 2 and published at 9, who made The Life of Larry, and then Larry and Steve, and then the 15-minute pilot in his kitchen. He was heading towards something that had always been waiting for him. But the path to it was not inevitable. It was the path he found through the specific landscape of chance and choice and talent and timing that constitutes a life. Section 20: The Show That Returned and the Show That Never Left. When Family Guy returned in May 2005 for its 4th season, two things were simultaneously true. The show was back, and the show had, in some fundamental way, already changed. The change was not visible in any single dramatic shift. The characters looked the same, the voices were the same, the Griffin house was the same, the drunken clam was the same, the familiar rhythms of the comedy were recognizable. For casual viewers coming to the new episodes with the memory of the old ones, the show was simply back. The thing they had loved returned. But the people who had made the first 3 seasons and the people who were making the 4th season were not identical. The writing staff had been rebuilt from scratch, because television writing staffs do not hold together through 3-year gaps. The original writers had moved on to Scrubs, to American Dad, to other projects, to careers that did not wait for a canceled show to possibly be resurrected. New writers had been brought in who had different sensibilities, different instincts about what was funny and what was worth exploring. MacFarlane was also, by 2005, a different person from the 25-year-old who had made the pilot. He was 31, significantly more successful, significantly more in demand. American Dad was launching simultaneously with Family Guy's return, which meant he was running 2 primetime animated shows at once. The specific quality of focused attention that he had brought to the first 3 seasons, the quality of someone making the most important thing they had ever made, with everything riding on it, was not available to him in the same way in 2005. This is not a criticism. It is simply the reality of what happens when a person grows from being a person with one thing to being a person with many things. The first thing necessarily gets a different kind of attention after that growth. Not worse attention necessarily, but different. The show that returned in 2005 was recognizably Family Guy. The comedy worked, the voices were right, the characters were present, but the invisible texture of the first 3 seasons, the quality that came from a single person's focused creative vision being applied to every aspect of a production, was beginning to diffuse. What is remarkable, given this, is how long the show retained enough of its original quality to remain genuinely excellent television. Seasons 4 and 5 are still strong. There are episodes in seasons 6 and 7 that rank among the best the show produced. The road to episodes featuring Brian and Stewie remained consistently excellent well into the show's later run. The specific combination of chemistry and writing that made those episodes work was resistant to the general decline in ways that much of the show's other content was not. The show that never left the idea of Family Guy that existed in the memories of its audience through the 3 years of cancellation that had been preserved in DVD sets and Adult Swim reruns was in some ways more perfect than any actual version of the show that had ever existed. Memories of things you love when they are gone tend toward improvement. The episodes you remember most vividly are the ones that worked best, not the ones that were adequate. The feeling you remember is the feeling of the show at its peak, not the feeling of the show on an average Tuesday. When the show came back, it was competing not with its historical average, but with the idealized memory of itself that the 3-year absence had allowed to form in the audience's mind. This is an impossible competition to win. No actual show, returning after years away, can be as good as the memory of it. What Family Guy managed in those first few seasons of its return was something impressive despite this challenge. It was often genuinely as good as the memory. The best episodes of seasons 4 and 5 are episodes that the original run would have been proud of. They demonstrate the characters at their best, the comedy at its sharpest, the emotional register at its most precisely calibrated. The slide that came afterward was gradual. It was the product of time and institutional drift and the specific challenge of maintaining creative quality across a production that, by its nature, required the effort of a large team over a long period. It was also the product of choices that, in retrospect, were not the right ones. Choices about where to take the characters, choices about how much to rely on the cutaway structure, choices about what kind of comedy the show should be. But the foundation was always there. The original design, the original characters, the original emotional logic. None of it was lost. It was covered over, sometimes, by what the show became, but it was always underneath. And the episodes that cut through to it, the ones scattered across the later seasons where the characters suddenly behaved like themselves and the comedy suddenly had the precision of the early run, those episodes proved that. The show knew what it was supposed to be, even when it was not being it. That is the story of Family Guy, not the story of a show that was always excellent and then declined. The story of a show that was excellent, then difficult, then sometimes excellent again, then more difficult, then occasionally surprising, across a span of more than 25 years, made by hundreds of people, led by one person who understood it better than anyone, and eventually stepped back from the daily practice of that understanding. The real Family Guy, the one that matters, the one that justifies the decades of discussion, is in the first 3 seasons and in the best episodes scattered through the seasons that followed. It is the specific combination of Seth MacFarlane's particular sensibility applied to animation with genuine creative investment. It is the boy from Kent, the student at RISD, the young man alone in his kitchen for 6 months, making the thing that had been waiting inside him to be made. That version of Family Guy is still there, in the episodes, available to watch. The fact that it coexists with a later version that is more complicated in its relationship to its own origins does not diminish it. If anything, it makes it more remarkable that those early episodes exist at all. That a 25-year-old creator with a $50,000 budget and 6 months in his kitchen produced something that would still be genuinely funny and surprisingly warm 25 years later. That is what Family Guy is, in its deepest version. That is why it was created, and that is why, whatever complications have accumulated around it, it matters. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight on your couch or in bed, with the lights low and the rest of the world briefly at a distance, I genuinely hope it was worth your time. There is something special about settling into the real stories behind the things we grew up watching, the human journeys underneath the cultural phenomena. Like this video if you made it to the end. Leave a comment with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I read as many of those as I can, and I love seeing where these videos find people. And subscribe if you want more long-form dives like this one into the stories behind the shows and the people and the moments that made the culture we all grew up inside. Rest well, wherever you are. Section 21: Everything that made it last. The question of why Family Guy has continued for more than 25 years is, in one sense, easily answered. It makes money. Animated shows are inexpensive to produce relative to live action. They generate value in streaming libraries and syndication. For years after original broadcast, they move merchandise globally, and they serve as reliable content for platforms that need recognizable brands. The economics of Family Guy's continued existence are not mysterious, but the economics do not fully explain why the show has maintained a cultural presence that goes beyond the simple fact of its continued production. There are shows that have been on the air for a long time and that nobody thinks about very much. Family Guy is not one of those shows. People argue about it, people quote it, people compare seasons. People have strong feelings about specific characters and specific episodes and specific creative decisions. The show matters to people in a way that purely commercial properties rarely manage to achieve, which suggests that the cultural attachment to Family Guy runs deeper than the mere fact of availability. What created and sustains that attachment is the show's best material, which remains genuinely excellent across decades of viewing. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy have aged remarkably well. Comedy that was considered edgy or transgressive in 1999 is in many cases more accepted now than it was then. The cultural references are dated in ways that are themselves interesting. The show is a time capsule of late 1990s and early 2000s, American popular culture in a form that is curated by someone with a very specific range of enthusiasms. The jokes that are funny because of Seth MacFarlane's particular sensibility are still funny. The jokes that were funny primarily because they were new are occasionally less funny, but even some of those have earned a kind of nostalgic warmth. The characters, in their original forms, continue to resonate in the way that well-constructed characters always do. Peter and Brian and Stewie and Lois are recognizable types who are also specific individuals, and the combination of typicality and specificity is what makes a fictional character last. They are familiar enough that we can project our own experiences onto them, and specific enough that they remain distinctly themselves rather than dissolving into generic archetypes. The show's place in the larger history of adult animation is secure. Alongside The Simpsons and South Park, Family Guy constitutes one of the foundational texts of what adult animated comedy can be. Each of the three shows found a different answer to the question of how animation could engage with adult themes and experiences. The Simpsons answered with warmth and character depth and sustained satirical intelligence. South Park answered with radicalism and formal experimentation, and a willingness to engage with the news cycle directly. Family Guy answered with the cutaway structure, with a particular kind of rapid-fire cultural satire, with the comedy of a specific working-class community living inside an animated format that freed it from the constraints of realistic representation. These are different answers, and each of them opened different possibilities for the shows that came after. The wave of adult animated shows that have appeared in the years since Family Guy's debut, Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, Solar Opposites, countless others, each owes something to one or more of these three foundational texts. Some owe something specific to Family Guy, the willingness to interrupt a narrative with a self-contained comedic tangent, the use of specific pop culture reference as a comedy mode, the idea that a cartoon family can be both genuinely funny and genuinely warm within the same episode. The influence of Family Guy on internet comedy culture is harder to trace precisely because it has been so pervasive. The cutaway gag format is essentially the format of the meme, of the short-form viral video, of the Twitter thread that interrupts itself with an anecdote, of the TikTok that pivots halfway through to something completely different. The cultural acceptance of the digression as a legitimate comedic structure, the idea that a joke does not have to build toward its punchline through a straight line, but can arrive at it through a sideways approach, is part of the broader comedic vocabulary of the internet era, and Family Guy was one of the early forces that normalized that approach in mainstream entertainment. MacFarlane's own evolution as a creator across the show's run reflects something true about what long-term creative work does to people. He started Family Guy as a young animator who needed to make this specific thing and who brought the full energy of that need to the project. He continued it as a successful producer who had expanded his creative life in many directions and who maintained his connection to the show primarily through the vocal performances that kept him literally present in its production. The version of Seth MacFarlane who is still in the recording booth, doing Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire, in 2025 is not the same person as the one who drew the pilot in his kitchen in 1997 and 1998, and the show reflects that transformation in its texture across the seasons. This is not unique to MacFarlane or to Family Guy. Every creator who makes something that lasts long enough eventually finds themselves in the position of maintaining a relationship with an earlier version of their own creative self. The work that an artist makes when they are 25 and burning with the specific energy of first creation is not the same as the work they make at 50, even if the style and the format and the characters are nominally the same. The relationship between the creator and the creation changes as both age. Some artists handle this gracefully. Some struggle with it. Most do both at different moments. MacFarlane has handled it by doing other things. The Orville, in particular, represents the creative investment that Family Guy had in its early years, but that the show can no longer quite sustain from him personally. The project where he is most fully present, most fully invested, most fully the person making something because he needs to make it, rather than because the economics suggest it should continue. The Orville has the quality of personal necessity. Family Guy, in its current form, has the quality of something that has earned its continuation and is carrying it forward with competence, if not quite with passion. The best of Family Guy and the best of it is genuinely great as a monument to a specific creative moment in a specific creative life. It is the record of what Seth MacFarlane had to say when he first had the platform to say it, and how he chose to say it, and why those choices produced something that millions of people found funny and true and worth watching repeatedly across decades. It is the product of Kent, Connecticut, and Rhode Island School of Design, and a borrowed office shared with King of the Hill writers, and a kitchen in Los Angeles, and the sound of a security guard's voice, and a flip book his parents found for a 5-year-old who already knew what he wanted to do with his life. It is, in the end, the specific and improbable and entirely human story of how one person's particular vision of a family in Rhode Island became something that the whole country watched and argued about, and quoted and remembered, for reasons that the economics of television can begin to explain but cannot fully account for. The reasons it lasted are the same reasons it was created. Because it was made with genuine feeling about genuine things. Because the humor came from somewhere real. Because the characters were constructed by someone who cared about what characters were for and what they could do, and who was, when he was most fully himself and most fully present in the work, one of the most gifted comedy writers American television has produced. That is what the show was. That is why it matters. And that is why, whatever complicated relationship its current form has with its own origins, the early episodes are still there, still fully alive with the energy of their making, still capable of making a room full of people laugh at Peter Griffin, doing something catastrophically stupid while Brian watches with patient exasperation, and Stewie plots the next iteration of world domination, and Lois tries to hold everything together with the particular kind of love that is too honest to be romanticized and too strong to be destroyed. The Griffin family, at their best, is real. That is the deepest thing you can say about a fictional family. They are real in the way that real things are real, because they were made by someone who needed them to be, and who understood what they were for, and who gave them enough of his own interior life that they could exist independently of him as fully realized people, as genuinely themselves. That is the real reason Family Guy was created, and it is enough. A note on the sources of this story. Everything discussed in this script draws from documented accounts, published interviews, and verified biographical sources. Seth MacFarlane has spoken about his childhood, his time at RISD, his years at Hanna-Barbera, and the creation of Family Guy in numerous interviews across more than 2 decades. He has talked about the life of Larry, about the Fox pitch, about the $50,000 budget, and the 6 months alone in his kitchen. The story of how he nearly boarded American Airlines Flight 11 on the 11th of September, 2001, is documented in multiple interviews, including appearances on The Howard Stern Show and with Piers Morgan, and is referenced in the Wikipedia entry for American Airlines Flight 11, among other sources. The ratings figures discussed, from the 22 million viewers of the pilot to the declining numbers of later seasons, are drawn from Nielsen ratings data reported in entertainment media across the show's run. The DVD sales figures of 2.2 million copies for the first and second season sets are widely reported and were cited in multiple publications, including USA Today and Entertainment Weekly, during the period of the show's revival. The writer's room composition for the first season: Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker, is documented in the Family Guy Wikipedia entry and in the show's own credits. MacFarlane's statement that he had not written for the show since 2010 comes from his 2017 Reddit AMA. The detail about the full 15-minute pitch pilot remaining lost media until 2022 and not being widely viewed until March 2025 is based on reports from Lost Media Wiki and other sources covering the pilot's recovery. The detail about Peter's voice being based on a security guard MacFarlane overheard at RISD is from MacFarlane's own accounts in various interviews. Stewie's voice being based on Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady is confirmed by MacFarlane himself in multiple interviews and in the Family Guy Wikipedia entry. The story of MacFarlane's connection with Adam West, which led to West voicing Mayor Adam West on the show, is documented in MacFarlane's accounts of his time at Hanna-Barbera on the Johnny Bravo crew. Where this script offers interpretive analysis about the emotional qualities of the early seasons, about the relationship between MacFarlane's biography and the show's content, about the significance of specific creative choices. These are the interpretations of the narrator, offered as considered perspectives on documented facts rather than as claims of objective fact. The goal throughout has been accuracy in matters of fact and honest interpretation in matters of analysis. Any errors that have crept in despite these intentions are genuinely unintentional. Total script: fall asleep to the real reason Family Guy was created. 21 sections plus source note. prepared for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Suitable for narration at approximately 130 to 140 words per minute. Estimated runtime at standard ASMR pacing, approximately 3.5 to 4 hours. Section 22. The animation industry that shaped the creator. To understand the specific form Family Guy took, it helps to understand the animation industry of the mid-1990s in some depth, because it was an industry in the middle of a significant transformation, and the character of that transformation shaped what Seth MacFarlane could do and how he could do it. When MacFarlane arrived at Hanna-Barbera in 1995, the studio that had once defined what American animation looked like for 3 decades was itself in transition. The Cartoon Network, which had launched in 1992, had initially built its programming around the classic libraries Hanna-Barbera had accumulated over decades. But by the mid-1990s, the network was developing original content through what it called the What a Cartoon showcase, a collection of short films by emerging animators, each one a pilot of sorts, each one testing a different visual style and comedic sensibility to see what the audience responded to. Fred Seibert, who was president of Hanna-Barbera during this period, had a specific vision for what the showcase could do. He wanted to find the next generation of animation talent and give them a platform before the major studios had locked them into established styles and approaches. He wanted to be present at the development of new creative voices rather than inheriting them after they had already formed elsewhere. This vision is why Ellen Cockrell, his head of development, was in the audience at a RISD senior screening in 1995. This vision is what led to MacFarlane being hired based on his writing rather than his drawing. The What a Cartoon showcase was the incubator for some of the most significant animated shows of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Powerpuff Girls developed from a What a Cartoon short. Dexter's Laboratory began this way. Johnny Bravo, where MacFarlane spent the most time during his Hanna-Barbera years, was a What a Cartoon development. The culture of the showcase was one of experimentation and risk-taking, of trying things that might not work because the format was specifically designed to absorb failures and learn from them. MacFarlane's Larry and Steve short aired as part of the Cartoon Network's World Premiere Toons block in 1997, which was effectively the same showcase rebranded. This was his entry into this world of experimental short-form animation, and it served the purpose Seibert had intended. It got the character concept in front of an audience and in front of network executives simultaneously. The primetime animation landscape was being shaped by The Simpsons on Fox and by the success of animated comedies on MTV and Comedy Central. Beavis and Butthead had proven that animation aimed at young adult males could be commercially significant. South Park, premiering in August 1997, demonstrated that animation in primetime could be genuinely controversial and successful simultaneously. That controversy was not the death of a show, but could be a driver of its cultural presence. All of this context told Fox, by 1997 and 1998, that the moment for a new adult animated show was right. King of the Hill had just shown that the format could work in a Sunday primetime slot. The Simpsons had now been on the air for nearly a decade and was demonstrating that animated shows could sustain for remarkable periods if the quality held. The audience for adult animation was real, growing, and demonstrably loyal. MacFarlane walked into this moment with a very specific product, the Larry and Steve concept, expanded and refined into the Family Guy pilot, and a very specific sensibility that was different from what was already on the air. His show was not as emotionally grounded as King of the Hill, which aimed at a gently satirical realism about Texas working-class life. It was not as politically transgressive as South Park. It was not as warmly affectionate as early Simpsons. It was doing something of its own that combined elements of all three while adding the specific comedy structure of The Cutaway and the specific emotional register of a New England working-class family that genuinely, imperfectly, awkwardly loved each other. The moment was right, the product was specific, and the creator was ready. These three things coinciding is what produces the kind of cultural impact that Family Guy had in its first years. Any one of them in isolation is insufficient. The moment without the product produces shows that catch a wave but have nothing to say. The product without the moment produces excellent work that nobody sees. The creator without both is talent in a vacuum. MacFarlane had all three simultaneously. That is rarer than it sounds. The Hanna-Barbera years also gave McFarlane something less tangible but perhaps more important than technical training. They gave him the experience of being inside a professional creative environment and understanding its dynamics from the inside. He knew how a writer's room worked. He knew how the relationship between writers and animators functioned. He knew what a showrunner did and what a staff writer did, and how those roles fit together. He knew the timeline from script to screen, the 10 months of production that he would describe in interviews about Family Guy. He knew the scale of the operation he was about to undertake. This knowledge is what allowed him to build the show so quickly and so completely once Fox gave him the green light. He was not discovering how to run an animated series as he went. He was applying knowledge he had accumulated through several years of professional work in animation, combined with the specific creative vision he had been developing since he was a child in Kent. The combination was what made it possible for a 25-year-old to function as the executive producer of a primetime animated series. The industry was also changing in ways that would affect the show's production and its reception. The rise of digital animation tools was beginning to shift the economics of animation production. The emergence of the internet as a distribution platform, still in its early form in 1999, would become enormously significant for Family Guy within 6 years of its premiere. The DVD market, which would prove crucial to the show's revival, was still developing in 1999. DVD players were still relatively expensive and not universally owned, but the trajectory was clearly toward widespread adoption. All of this is the context into which Family Guy was born. A specific creative voice, arriving at a specific cultural moment in a specific industry that was in the middle of a transformation that would prove enormously favorable to the kind of show McFarlane was making. The show succeeded in its first iteration and in its revival because of the quality of its creation, but also because of the particular moment in which it was created and in which it found its audience. Timing in entertainment is not everything, but it is more than most people like to admit. McFarlane's timing, across the whole arc of the story we have been telling, was remarkably good. He arrived at Hanna-Barbera just as the studio was expanding its investment in original content through the What a Cartoon showcase. He pitched Family Guy to Fox just after King of the Hill proved the viability of animated adult sitcoms in Sunday primetime. He found his audience through Adult Swim and DVD sales just as both of those distribution channels were hitting their cultural peak. He returned to primetime just as YouTube was launching, and his show's format was proving perfectly suited to internet virality. None of this was luck, exactly. Some of it was good instinct about the landscape he was moving through. Some of it was the persistence of a person who did not stop trying to make the thing they needed to make even when the industry around them was not obviously ready for it. But some of it was also the specific kind of fortune that visits people who are sufficiently prepared to recognize it and act on it when it appears. The boy from Kent was prepared. Everything about his life from the age of 2 onward had been preparing him. And when the moment came, he recognized it. That is the final thing worth saying about the real reason Family Guy was created. It was created because a person who had been preparing his whole life for a particular opportunity finally had that opportunity and took it fully and well. The preparation was the childhood and the education and the industry years. The opportunity was Fox and the $50,000 budget and the 6 months alone in the kitchen. And the taking of it fully and well was Death Has a Shadow, airing after Super Bowl 33 to 22 million people on the 31st of January, 1999. Everything else is history.